Hey there, curious minds. Tonight we're stepping into a sunny Hollywood backyard in May of 1953, where a British psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond is standing in a kitchen, carefully measuring out 0.4 of a gram of mescaline for a very famous houseguest. That guest, Aldous Huxley. Yes, the same guy who wrote Brave New World, and in about an hour he's going to walk out into the garden and see a flower so intensely that it will basically reset his entire understanding of what reality is. No big deal, just a regular Tuesday. Huxley later said he saw the world the way Adam saw it on the first morning of creation. Now, I don't know about you, but the closest I've ever come to that feeling is finding my keys right where I left them. 70 years later, the spiritual revolution he promised us never quite showed up to the party. But modern neuroscience is finally starting to explain what actually happened in that garden, and it's wilder than you'd think. So before we dive in, hit that like button if you're ready for a deep one tonight, and drop a comment down below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? I love seeing who's along for the ride. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's unravel this dream together. To really understand what was unfolding in that garden, we have to back up a little and take a good look at the man holding the glass of mescaline water. Because Aldous Huxley wasn't some random celebrity chasing a novel kind of thrill. He was, by 1953, one of the most respected minds in the English-speaking world, a novelist, essayist, philosopher, and a walking library of ideas. He read dictionaries for fun. He could quote obscure mystics from the 14th century by memory and then pivot, in the same breath, to the latest research on brain chemistry. And over the course of his long and restless life, he had written not one, but two completely contradictory prophecies about where humanity was headed. Two visions pointing in opposite directions, both from the same pen. And the strange thing is, the world we live in today looks like a slightly awkward blend of the two, which is exactly what makes his story so worth sitting with tonight. The first of those prophecies appeared in 1932, and its title has become one of those phrases that floats through the modern vocabulary, whether you've read the book or not. Brave New World. The setting is a future civilization that has solved all the old problems. No war, no hunger, no heartbreak, no messy emotions to trip you up on your way to the office. Everyone is engineered from conception for their social role. Everyone is conditioned from infancy to love the work they are assigned, to consume the products they are sold, and to be mildly but constantly satisfied. And if, somehow, a sliver of discontent manages to wriggle through the cracks, there is a convenient little pill called Soma waiting in every medicine cabinet. Soma is the government-issued escape hatch, a clean, pleasant, chemically guaranteed vacation from any feeling that might otherwise make you ask uncomfortable questions. The brilliance of Huxley's dystopia, and the reason it has aged so uncomfortably well, is that nobody in it is screaming. Nobody is dragged off in the night. The citizens of the world state aren't oppressed in the way we usually picture oppression. They are gently, cheerfully, deliciously distracted. They've been shopping mauled into submission, and they love it. Which unfortunately lands a lot closer to home than most of us would like to admit when we glance up from our phones long enough to notice. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how prescient the whole Soma concept turned out to be. Huxley dreamed up this pleasant little pharmaceutical in 1931, decades before the modern antidepressant was invented, decades before anyone had heard of a benzodiazepine, and a full lifetime before the term wellness industry entered common usage, and yet he nailed the shape of it. He understood that the most effective form of social control would not look like control at all. It would look like customer service. It would look like convenience. It would come wrapped in soft pastel packaging and be endorsed by smiling faces in well-lit commercials. Soma, in his novel, is not forced on anyone. It is offered gently, repeatedly, cheerfully, until taking it becomes the default rhythm of daily life. You don't notice the door closing behind you, because the door is a beautiful door, and someone keeps bringing you refreshments. Huxley wrote that novel as a warning. He watched the rise of mass production, mass advertising, mass media, and mass psychology in the 1920s, and he extrapolated those trends forward with the cold precision of a man drawing a logical diagram. The result was a world where comfort had replaced meaning, where pleasure had replaced purpose, and where anything resembling genuine inner experience had been quietly legislated out of existence, because it was simply bad for productivity. The inhabitants of Brave New World don't pray. They don't meditate, they don't grieve, they don't wonder, they consume, they copulate on schedule, and they take their soma. And when death comes, as it still must, even in utopia, they're wheeled into hospitals where children are brought in to watch, conditioned to associate dying with candy and cheerful music, so that by adulthood the whole messy business has been emotionally sanded smooth. Huxley, being Huxley, made this horrifying on purpose. He did not think a frictionless life was a good life. He thought a frictionless life was a kind of beautifully decorated coffin. Now fast forward 22 years, past a global depression, a world war, the atomic bomb, and a personal spiritual journey that took Huxley deep into Eastern philosophy, comparative mysticism, and the writings of contemplatives from every major tradition, and you arrive at 1954. That's the year he published his second great prophecy, which at first glance looks like it was written by a completely different person. The book is called The Doors of Perception, and it is, essentially, the field report from that afternoon in the Hollywood garden we met at the start. Short book. Maybe you could read it on a long flight. But inside those pages, Huxley does something audacious. He proposes that the same species he described as hopelessly lost in Brave New World might have a way home, that there might be, embedded in human biology, a switch, a chemical, neurological, entirely physical switch that could be flipped to restore the sense of wonder, meaning, and connection that industrial modernity had so efficiently ground into dust. And that switch, in his case, had just been flipped by 0.4 of a gram of mescaline. Context matters here. Huxley hadn't stumbled into this experiment on a whim. By the early 1950s, he had spent decades collecting reports of what he called the perennial philosophy, that strange, stubborn core of overlapping claims that shows up in Christian contemplatives, Sufi poets, Zen roshis, Hindu sages, and indigenous ceremonial traditions on 6 continents. Different vocabularies, different symbols, different clothes, but underneath something oddly consistent, a claim that ordinary perception is a crust, and that underneath the crust is something vast, luminous, and friendly, in a way our usual categories can barely handle. Huxley had come to suspect that this claim was not a coincidence, not a cultural borrowing, and not a pleasant fiction people told each other to feel better about death. He suspected it was a report from many places and many centuries about the same underlying feature of reality. And he wanted to know if there was a way to test that suspicion without signing up for 40 years of monastic silence. Which is, naturally, how he ended up on a couch in Los Angeles, supervised by a psychiatrist with a thermos and a notebook, waiting for a small glass of water to rearrange his sense of the universe. The title itself is a small theological bombshell. Huxley borrowed it from a line in the poetry of William Blake, the strange visionary English artist who spent the late 1700s drawing angels he claimed to see perched on trees in his garden, and who wrote, quite casually, that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to a human being as it truly is, which is to say, infinite. Blake was not exactly the kind of writer you invited to polite dinner parties. Most of his contemporaries considered him charmingly unhinged, but Huxley, writing a century and a half later, took that line seriously. He thought Blake was onto something literal, not metaphorical, not poetic flourish, literal. Huxley believed there was a set of doors in the human nervous system, and that under ordinary conditions those doors stayed firmly shut for very practical reasons, and that what lay behind them was not nonsense or hallucination, but a direct, unfiltered view of reality itself. To explain this, Huxley reached for a metaphor that has honestly held up remarkably well, considering he came up with it while partially under the influence. He proposed that the brain is not really a producer of consciousness, but a kind of reducing valve. Think of a fire hose connected to a faucet. The fire hose is the universe, pouring in an overwhelming torrent of information, sensation, and what Huxley, borrowing from the philosopher C.D. Broad, called mind at large. The faucet is your brain, narrowing that torrent down to a thin, manageable trickle, just enough to keep you alive, help you find dinner, and remember where you parked. The faucet is not a bug, it is a feature. If the full hose came through at once, you wouldn't function. You couldn't cross the street. You couldn't decide which of 17 breakfast cereals to buy. You'd just stand there, drowning in the infinite. So evolution, being practical, installed the valve, And everyone gets a slightly different model depending on their culture, their language, and their upbringing. The valve keeps you usefully alive. It also keeps you most of the time almost completely disconnected from the full scope of what is actually going on. What psychedelics do, in Huxley's framing, is briefly loosen the valve. They widen the opening. More of the hose comes through. And for a few hours you get a taste of the raw, unmediated stream that the mystics and the contemplatives have been writing about for thousands of years in every language they could get their hands on. Suddenly a flower is not just a flower. It is a pulsing, vibrating, luminous event that seems to contain within itself the entire history of living things. A pleat in a pair of grey flannel trousers becomes, as Huxley famously noted, an inexhaustible labyrinth of significance. This sounds absurd, and Huxley knew it sounded absurd. He was a novelist. He was trained to notice absurdity. But his claim was that the absurdity is only absurd from the perspective of ordinary perception. From the other side of the valve, it is ordinary perception that looks absurd, because ordinary perception has been filtering out the most important information all along. And here is where the second prophecy gets really bold and really specific. Huxley believed that this was not just an interesting experience for a small number of philosophically inclined literary types. He believed it could, potentially, be the foundation of a new kind of spirituality for the modern world. Religion, he argued, had become, in most industrialized societies, a matter of words, rituals, and vague beliefs that most practitioners didn't actually experience as real. People showed up on Sundays, mumbled through some prayers, and went home to resume their regularly scheduled lives. The text spoke of direct encounter with the divine, but the direct encounter itself had gotten lost somewhere along the way, preserved only in the lives of a rare handful of saints, mystics, and contemplatives who had spent decades training themselves into states the rest of us never tasted. What if, Huxley asked, we could democratize that taste? What if the direct experience, the one at the root of every contemplative tradition, could be made available to ordinary people on a Tuesday, without requiring them to disappear into a monastery for 30 years? Not to replace traditional practice, not to skip the work of integration and ethical living, but as an opening, a glimpse, a reminder that the infinite is, in fact, not an abstract concept in a dusty book, but a live and ever-present feature of reality itself. This was, by any measure, a wildly optimistic prediction, and it is exactly the opposite of the gloomy prediction he made in 1932. In Brave New World, chemistry is the enemy. Soma is the tool by which a slick totalitarian state keeps its citizens dozy and compliant. In The Doors of Perception, chemistry is potentially the hero. Mescaline is the tool by which ordinary perception is cracked open and something deeper is allowed to flood in. Same author, same general interest in how substances shape the mind. Opposite conclusions about what that shaping might mean. It's almost as if Huxley was laying out a branching path for humanity, and saying, here are two directions we could go. Here is the sedative route, where we medicate ourselves into contented unconsciousness, and here is the revelatory route, where we use molecules as keys to throw open long-locked doors. Choose wisely. Spoiler alert. We did not exactly choose wisely. Take a look around. Anxiety medications are among the most prescribed drugs in the industrialized world. Sleep aids are a multi-billion-dollar industry. Social media has evolved into a kind of low-grade pharmaceutical in its own right, dispensing tiny, carefully calibrated hits of emotional stimulation to keep us scrolling past our own lives. The average adult in a wealthy country spends more hours a day staring at a glowing rectangle than they spend talking to another human being face to face. We are not quite the citizens of the world state yet, but the outline is uncomfortably familiar. Meanwhile, the revelatory route Huxley described has been, for most of the last 70 years, pushed to the fringes, criminalized, mocked, misunderstood, or confined to subcultures that most of society prefers to keep at arm's length. The Soma track got paved into a superhighway. The mescaline track got turned into a hiking trail with warning signs posted at the trailhead, which is why that gap between his two prophecies is not just a neat literary contrast, it is the engine of everything we're going to be talking about over the next several hours. Huxley was, among other things, a diagnostician. He saw where the mass society of his era was heading, and he saw what it was going to cost us, not in obvious tyranny, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible hollowing out of inner life. And he believed, with the slightly embarrassing earnestness of a man who had just seen a folding chair glow with divine significance, that there was a remedy hidden in plain sight. Not a perfect remedy, not a shortcut, but an opening. A way to remind the hollowed-out modern mind that it was in fact still connected to something vast and strange and alive. And he believed modern science, rather than traditional religion, would be the institution best equipped to deliver that reminder, which is either hilarious or visionary depending on how the next few decades unfold. To understand why that second prophecy hit him so hard, though, and why the mescaline afternoon felt less like a drug experience and more like a metaphysical emergency, we have to leave the garden for a while and take a small, slightly unexpected detour. We are going to talk about entropy. Yes, the physics term, the one that shows up in thermodynamics textbooks and occasionally on coffee mugs belonging to people who want you to know they took a class once. Stay with me here, because this detour is actually the shortcut. You cannot understand what psychedelics do to the brain, or why Huxley's vision matters, or why any living thing looks the way it does, until you sit for a moment with the strange, slightly terrifying fact that you exist at all. Entropy is, in the simplest possible terms, a measure of disorder. It's the physicist's way of putting a number on how messy a system is, or more precisely, how many different arrangements of the little parts would look indistinguishable from a bird's eye view. A neatly shuffled deck of cards, sorted by suit and number, has low entropy. There is essentially only one way for it to be arranged that way. Toss that same deck down a flight of stairs, and entropy skyrockets, because now there are trillions of different possible arrangements of 52 cards that would all look equally chaotic from across the room. The second law of thermodynamics, which is one of the most reliable rules in all of physics, states that in a closed system, entropy always increases over time. Things fall apart. They do not spontaneously put themselves back together. Rooms get messy, coffee cools down, buildings crumble. The universe, taken as a whole, is slowly but relentlessly marching toward a state of maximum disorder. Here's the classic demonstration. Take a clear glass of water, hold a dropper of ink above it, let one drop fall. For a moment, there is a neat dark tendril hanging in the water, a little tadpole of concentrated pigment. Then, because water molecules are constantly jostling around and ink molecules are along for the ride, that tendril begins to spread. It fuzzes, it blurs, it diffuses. Within a minute or two, the ink has distributed itself throughout the entire glass, and you are left with a uniformly tinted cup of water. That is entropy doing its thing. And here is the key point. You would not, in 1,000 lifetimes of watching glasses of water, expect to see the reverse. You do not expect the diffused ink to suddenly reorganize itself into a tidy little tendril and hop back into the dropper. It is not impossible, technically. The laws of physics don't forbid it. But the probability is so absurdly small that even if you sat there for the entire age of the universe, you would almost certainly never see it happen. Ash does not reconstitute itself into wood. A shattered vase does not hop back onto the table. Entropy only runs one direction, forward. And now imagine, for a second, that you're sitting there watching that glass of ink in water, and it does the impossible thing. The dispersed pigment starts gathering. The particles swim upstream against every statistical law in the book. A tendril reforms. And then, not only does the tendril reform, it begins to move. It pulses. It takes in sugar from the water. It starts to grow. It starts to divide. It starts, in some small rudimentary way, to breathe. At that point you would put down your coffee and say one of two things. Either I am hallucinating, which given the subject of tonight's discussion, would be thematically appropriate. Or, and this is the interesting one, that ink is alive. Because that fundamentally is what every living thing on this planet is doing, every single second, whether it is a paramecium in a pond or a human being watching a video late at night. It is running a small, stubborn, extremely local rebellion against the most reliable law in physics. It is gathering itself when everything in the universe is conspiring to smear it out. Life is a statistical anomaly, an island of order in an ocean of decay. When you cut yourself, the wound closes. When you eat, you extract specific kinds of molecular order from your food and use them to maintain the specific molecular order that you are. When you breathe, you exchange gases in precisely calibrated ratios. Every cell in your body is, right now, burning energy to keep itself from dissolving into the generic chemical soup that surrounds it. Stop doing that work even briefly, and the soup wins. Death, in this framing, is not some mysterious external force that arrives to take you. Death is the moment your local rebellion against entropy ends and the universe's default setting reasserts itself. The ink finally disperses. And because the ink tendril rebellion is so wildly unlikely, so statistically improbable, the simple fact that you exist at all, reading or listening to these words, is itself the most extraordinary thing you will encounter in any given day. You're a temporary self-maintaining pocket of impossibility, which, when you put it that way, is maybe a little more impressive than what most of us manage to acknowledge before our second cup of coffee. This framing was not really available to Huxley in 1953. The deep mathematical connections between entropy, life, and consciousness were still being worked out, but it is essential for us tonight, because it sets up the question that modern neuroscience finally has the tools to answer. If living things are fundamentally in the business of resisting entropy, of maintaining their improbable little island of order against the tide, then the brain, which is the most complicated object we know of in the universe, must be in the same business in a particularly dramatic way. And that brings us to one of the most influential, and, depending on who you ask, most maddeningly abstract thinkers in contemporary science. A quiet, bespectacled British neuroscientist named Carl Friston. Friston is not exactly a household name, which is a little funny given that by some metrics he is the most cited neuroscientist alive. His work appears on thousands upon thousands of academic papers. He has spent decades at University College London working on a single stubborn question. What is the underlying principle that governs every living system, from a single bacterium up through an entire human brain, and possibly even entire societies? Is there one rule that explains them all? Most scientists, when faced with a question that grand, politely back away and go get another coffee. Friston, unfortunately for those of us trying to summarize his work in a single paragraph, said yes, and then spent 30 years working out the math. The principle he arrived at goes by several names. The free energy principle is the most common, and it is, depending on how generously you squint at it, either one of the most important intellectual contributions of the last century, or an extremely elegant description of something we could have figured out with less algebra. Let's see what you think. Here is the core idea, stripped of its equations. Every living system, in order to keep existing, has to keep its internal states within a very narrow range. Your body temperature, as mentioned, has to hover close to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Your blood sugar has to stay within certain bounds or you pass out. Your blood pH has to sit inside a ridiculously tight window, or your cells stop working. This is true for fish too. A fish has to stay in water. A fish in the open air is a fish in trouble. This is true for a bacterium. This is true for a potted plant. Every living thing has a relatively small set of internal conditions compatible with continued existence, and an absolutely vast set of conditions that are incompatible. The number of ways to be dead is astronomically larger than the number of ways to be alive, which is, in effect, another way of saying what we just said about entropy. Being alive is statistically rare. Being not alive is statistically easy. So the central challenge for any living thing is to resist, continuously, the pull toward all those easier configurations. Friston formalized this by saying that every living system, whether it knows it or not, is in the business of minimizing surprise. Not surprise in the emotional, jumping at shadows sense. Surprise in a specific statistical sense. An event is surprising if, according to your internal model of the world, it was unlikely to happen. A fish unexpectedly finding itself out of water experiences an enormous amount of statistical surprise, because the fish's internal wiring essentially expects water to be there. That surprise is, biologically speaking, bad news. It usually precedes death, so every living system has built into it, at multiple levels, a relentless drive to avoid configurations its internal model considers unlikely. It wants to keep finding itself in the situations it has come to expect. Water, for the fish. Correct temperature, for your skin. Correct oxygen levels, for your lungs. The homeostatic systems of the body are, in this light, basically a set of predictive models running underneath your awareness, each one silently forecasting what should be happening and nudging the physical machinery whenever reality drifts off script. Your heart, for example, is not just beating at random. Your body has a sophisticated expectation of what the heart rate ought to be doing under any given conditions. Resting, walking, climbing stairs, running from something with teeth. If the actual heart rate starts to deviate from the expected heart rate, signals get sent, hormones get released, and corrective action gets taken, all without you having to think about it. The same is true for breathing, digestion, blood pressure, and every other maintenance function. Your body is, in effect, one giant ongoing prediction, and the job of all those predictions is to keep you close enough to your expected configuration that entropy cannot pull you apart faster than you can knit yourself back together. You are, from this angle, less like a machine and more like a very elaborate weather forecast that keeps rerunning itself and also happens to be wearing pants. Think about what happens when you stand up too quickly after sitting for a long time. You get that brief swimmy sensation, maybe a flash of lightheadedness, because your blood pressure momentarily failed to match the predicted configuration for an upright body. Within a second or two, internal sensors notice the mismatch, your nervous system sends out corrective signals, vessels constrict, blood redistributes, and the world stops tilting. You didn't decide any of that. You didn't consciously tell your circulatory system to get its act together. A network of tiny predictive loops noticed an error, flagged it, and resolved it, all while you were still reaching for your keys. Multiply that process by every organ, every tissue, every cell, every chemical gradient, and you get a rough picture of the sheer quantity of silent forecasting happening inside you at every moment you are alive. Most of it never rises to the level of awareness. It doesn't need to. The whole point is that the machinery runs well enough that you can spend your attention on other things, like wondering whether the light in the fridge really turns off when you close the door. Now here is the leap that makes Friston's work so compelling for the story we're telling tonight. If the body is, at its core, a prediction engine working to keep itself alive, then the brain, that 3-pound swirl of wet electricity at the top of you, is simply the most elaborate and abstract extension of that same project. The brain's first and most fundamental job is not poetry. It is not calculus. It is not even really thinking as most of us picture it. The brain's first job, the one it has been shaped by evolution to perform for hundreds of millions of years, is to keep the body alive by generating accurate predictions about what the outside world is likely to do, and about how the body should respond to stay within its narrow, livable range. Everything else the brain does, the dreaming, the planning, the philosophizing, the regretting, the falling in love, the writing of novels about future dystopias, is built on top of that original prediction machinery. It is, in a sense, that same machinery running on weirder and weirder fuel. This is a strange thing to hear for the first time, and it takes a minute to settle. Most of us grow up assuming that the brain is, a kind of camera. Light hits the eye sends a picture to the brain, and the brain looks at the picture. Sound comes in through the ear sends the sound to the brain, and the brain hears it. This is, it turns out, almost completely wrong. The brain does not really work like a camera at all. It works much more like a forecaster. It is constantly generating from its own internal models a best guess about what the outside world is probably up to at any given moment, and then using the incoming sensory information mostly to check and correct that guess, which is a wildly more efficient way to run a nervous system, and also explains a lot of strange little experiences you've probably had without thinking twice about them. Like the way you can read a whole sentence with a typo in it, and not notice the typo, because your brain simply predicted what the word should be. Or the way you can walk through your own house in the dark and mostly not bump into things, because your brain has a very detailed internal map and is running that map even when the visual input is nearly zero. And this, finally, is why the detour through entropy and Friston matters for everything that follows. Because if the brain is a prediction engine, optimized by evolution to generate an extremely narrow and reliable simulation of reality, then what we experience as ordinary waking consciousness is not a direct view of the world. It is the output of an extremely disciplined forecaster. It is a finely tuned model designed to keep us alive in a cold, complicated, indifferent universe. That model is astonishingly good at what it does. You can cross a crowded intersection, catch a ball, recognize your mother from 200 yards away, and taste the difference between two nearly identical olive oils, all because your predictive machinery has been polished by millions of years of selection pressure. But the very qualities that make the model so useful, its tightness, its reliability, its aggressive filtering out of anything that doesn't serve immediate survival, are also exactly what Huxley meant when he called the brain a reducing valve. The model is a masterpiece of narrowing, and what psychedelics do, we are starting to understand in real mathematical detail, is briefly pry the model open, They soften the predictions. They widen the valve. They let more of the hose through. What comes through is, for a few hours, everything the forecaster had been working so hard to leave out. And in that flood, a man standing in a Hollywood garden can look at an ordinary flower and feel, with complete conviction, that he is seeing the morning of creation. Which is a very long way of saying that before we can really follow Huxley through the door, we first had to understand what the door is made of. It is made of prediction. It is made of expectation. It is made of the trillions of little forecasts running under the hood of every living thing, all pointed in the same direction, all whispering the same simple instruction to the universe. Stay, stay, stay. From here, things get much stranger, because once you accept that ordinary reality is itself a kind of disciplined guess, the question is no longer how psychedelics can make things weird. The question is how anything ever seems normal in the first place. If the brain's deepest job is to predict, the obvious next question is how, exactly, it manages to make predictions that are anywhere near accurate enough to keep you from walking into walls. To answer that, we have to take a small detour into 18th century England, which is not usually where you expect a conversation about psychedelic neuroscience to end up, but here we are. In a quiet parsonage somewhere in Kent, a Presbyterian minister named Thomas Bayes was spending his evenings doing something that, frankly, most of his parishioners would have found baffling. He was working out the mathematics of belief. Not belief in the theological sense, which would at least have made his career choice look consistent, but belief in the probabilistic sense. How should a rational creature update what it thinks about the world when new information arrives? Bayes never published the result. He died in 1761, and a friend dug the manuscript out of his papers and sent it to the Royal Society, where it sat for a while and was politely admired before being mostly forgotten for a century. Naturally. The formula Bayes worked out, which now bears his name, describes something so intuitive that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Imagine you wake up in the morning and glance out the window. The sidewalk is wet. What do you conclude? Well, you probably conclude it rained overnight, but strictly speaking, you don't actually know that. The sidewalk could be wet for any number of reasons. A sprinkler could have malfunctioned. A neighbour could have been washing their car at 3 a.m, which would be odd but not technically impossible. A water main could have burst. What your mind does, in a fraction of a second and without any conscious effort on your part, is weigh all these possibilities against what you already know. You know it rains a lot this time of year. You know your neighbour is not, as a general rule, the car washing type. You know you haven't heard any emergency vehicles. You combine your prior beliefs about how the world usually behaves with the single, new piece of evidence, wet sidewalk, and you arrive, almost instantly, at the conclusion most likely to be correct. It rained. Bayes showed that this process could be written down as a formula, one that tells you precisely how much weight to give to your old beliefs versus the new information. It is an elegant little piece of math, and evolution, it turns out, beat the Reverend Bayes to the punch by a few 100 million years. The reason Bayesian logic is so well suited to the brain, and the reason evolution clearly stumbled into something very similar, long before any clergyman worked it out on paper, comes down to efficiency. Every organism that has ever existed has had to make decisions with incomplete information. The rabbit deciding whether that rustle in the grass is a fox or a breeze does not have time to study statistics. The early human deciding whether the dark shape on the horizon is a storm or a herd does not have access to peer-reviewed data. Any creature that could combine its past experiences with a fresh piece of evidence and arrive, very quickly, at a sensible answer was going to out-survive a creature that could not. So evolution shaped neural machinery that performs these combinations continuously, effortlessly, and below the level of conscious attention. By the time Bayes sat down with his quill, the process he was describing had already been running, in various flavours, inside every animal with a nervous system for several 100 million years. He wasn't inventing rationality. He was catching up to it. Your brain has been doing exactly this, at absolutely ridiculous speeds, every second of your waking life, since before you were born. Every experience updates an enormous internal library of expectations. The library starts out mostly empty, which is why babies stare at everything with that particular flavour of wide-eyed astonishment that makes adults reach for their phones. Then, through repetition and experience, the library fills up. Faces, voices, the shape of your own hand, the feel of gravity, the way objects behave when you drop them, the sound of a closing door, the smell of your kitchen. Each encounter nudges your internal model toward a slightly more accurate picture of what the world tends to do. By the time you are, say, 30 years old, the library is so comprehensive that you could walk around your neighborhood blindfolded and still guess, with uncanny accuracy, what was happening on any given block. Here is where it gets strange. If your brain were really running Bayes' theorem the tidy textbook way, every time you opened your eyes it would have to sit down, light a pipe, and perform an astronomical number of calculations to figure out what you were looking at. Every photon hitting your retina would need to be cross-referenced with every possible cause in the universe, weighted against every belief you had ever acquired, and combined into a final probability estimate. By the time the math finished, you would have starved. You would never make it across the kitchen. The brain, being a practical organ, does not play by tidy textbook rules. It takes a shortcut. And that shortcut is one of the most important discoveries in modern cognitive science, because once you understand it, an enormous number of otherwise baffling experiences suddenly make sense. From optical illusions to déjà vu to the reason you sometimes hear your own name in crowded rooms when no one actually said it. The shortcut goes like this. Instead of starting from the raw sensory input and working out what must be causing it, your brain starts from what it already expects to be out there, generates a prediction of what the incoming signal should look like, and then compares the prediction with the actual signal. And here is the really clever part. The only thing that travels further up into your processing systems is the difference between the two. The error, the mismatch. If the prediction is perfect, the error is zero, and almost nothing has to be done. If the prediction is off, the error gets sent upstream to be dealt with, and the model gets adjusted to reduce the mismatch next time. This is often called predictive processing, and it is, in a very literal sense, what your brain is doing right now as your eyes move across this text. It is not reading the words the way a scanner would read them. It is guessing what the next word is going to be, confirming or correcting that guess when the actual word arrives, and feeding the correction back into its internal model of language, writers, sentences, and videos about the nature of consciousness. You're not so much receiving this text as you are collaborating with it, and the collaboration is so seamless that it feels like straightforward perception. Which brings us to the slightly uncomfortable punchline. You do not actually see the world. You see your best guess about the world. Most of the time, the guess is extraordinarily accurate, so the distinction doesn't matter. You reach for the coffee mug, your fingers close around the handle, the coffee gets drunk, and there is no evidence from the inside that you ever did anything other than interact directly with external reality. But every once in a while the machinery slips, and the difference between the prediction and the raw input becomes visible, and the whole illusion wobbles for a second. You experience that wobble as an optical illusion, or a mishearing, or one of those moments when you walk into a room and for half a heartbeat cannot figure out why your own kitchen looks unfamiliar. You're not experiencing reality glitching. You're experiencing your prediction machinery being caught in the act. The dress is a perfect, almost embarrassing example. A few years ago, a photograph appeared on the internet of an ordinary striped dress, and for about 48 hours it accomplished what decades of philosophy had failed to do. It made millions of people viscerally aware that their perception was constructed. Half the people who looked at the picture saw a dress that was clearly white and gold. The other half saw a dress that was clearly blue and black. And these two groups could not, under any circumstances, see what the other group was seeing. They argued about it. They showed the picture to their spouses and their co-workers. They measured the pixel values, which, in a fun twist, turned out to be ambiguous enough that both interpretations were technically defensible. What was actually happening is that different brains, based on their prior assumptions about lighting conditions in the original photograph, were generating different predictions about what the true colours of the fabric must be. Some brains assumed the dress was under warm artificial light and adjusted accordingly. Others assumed it was in cool daylight shade and adjusted the opposite way. Both groups were experiencing a fully formed, confidently delivered perception of colour. Both groups were, strictly speaking, hallucinating, because the brain was filling in information the raw photo did not contain. The only difference was that both hallucinations were so convincing that neither side could accept the other's experience as legitimate. One low-quality phone photograph of a piece of clothing accidentally revealed, to a lot of people at once, that the thing we all walk around calling seeing is not really seeing at all. It is a committee of internal assumptions wearing a costume. This is roughly what the philosopher and neuroscientist Neil Seth has in mind when he describes ordinary waking consciousness as a controlled hallucination. The phrase sounds provocative, and it is meant to, but once you sit with it, it turns out to be almost a technical description. A hallucination, in the psychiatric sense, is a perception that has no corresponding external cause. An ordinary perception is a perception that does have an external cause, but that external cause is filtered through so many layers of prediction, inference, and prior expectation that most of what you end up consciously experiencing was, in fact, generated internally. The incoming sensory signal contributes much less than you would intuitively guess. Some estimates suggest that in vision, the majority of the information flowing through the visual cortex at any given moment is top-down, generated by the brain itself, rather than bottom-up from the eyes. Your visual system is, in effect, projecting a movie of the world, and your eyeballs are providing occasional notes from the audience. Usually the notes and the movie match up well enough that the distinction is invisible. Occasionally they don't, and a dress breaks the internet for a weekend. This also explains a whole category of small, mostly harmless experiences that tend to pile up as you move through a day. Consider the way you can walk into a familiar kitchen in low light and, for a fraction of a second, be absolutely certain that a coat draped over a chair is a person standing there. The brain generates a quick prediction based on the rough outline it can detect, and because humans are the most important shape in any human's environment, the system defaults toward person until better data arrive. A heartbeat later, the additional information comes in, the model corrects itself, and you feel slightly foolish. Or think about how often you have said something to a family member who you were convinced was in the next room, only to discover, several sentences in, that you have been talking to an empty hallway. Your brain was running a model in which that person existed nearby, and the model was confident enough to generate your side of a conversation before the absence of the other half managed to register. The machinery is mostly right, often enough that these moments feel like minor mental hiccups, rather than the small peaks behind the curtain that they actually are. There is another, subtler class of examples worth mentioning, because it shows how deep the modelling goes. Every time you speak, you are also, in a very small way, hearing yourself speak. But here is the thing. The version of your voice you hear from inside your head, the one that drives conversations and the private monologue of your inner life, is not what anyone else hears. Recordings of your own voice sound wrong to you for a reason. Your brain has been modelling the sound of your speech from the inside, complete with vibrations conducted through bone and tissue, and that internal model is the version you have come to accept as your real voice. The external recording is what you actually sound like to the rest of the world. Both are real, only one is the one you trust. Your confidence in the wrong one is a reminder that almost everything you experience, even the sound of the voice you use every day, has been assembled for you by a committee of internal processes you never get to meet. Now, if everyday perception is already a kind of hallucination, just one that stays tightly tethered to the outside world, then what exactly separates your average Tuesday afternoon from, say, what Huxley was experiencing out there in the garden? The surprising answer is that it's a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind. In both cases, the brain is generating a model, running predictions and projecting an experience. In ordinary perception, the prediction machinery is held on a very short leash by the incoming sensory data. Every guess gets checked against reality almost instantly, and any guess that doesn't match gets corrected hard and fast. The hallucination stays controlled. When certain substances enter the picture and begin tinkering with the receptors that tune the strength of those top-down predictions, the leash gets longer. The predictions still happen, but they are less tightly constrained by sensory input. The model is allowed to wander further from the incoming signal. Meanings that would normally be filtered out as irrelevant bubble up. Connections that the usual machinery would have suppressed suddenly feel vivid and important. A flower stops being a quick sensory shortcut for the category of thing called flower and starts being instead a throbbing miracle that the brain is perfectly willing to treat with the seriousness it perhaps always deserved. Same machinery, looser leash, that's it. That's the trick. This framing is useful because it dissolves a lot of the mystique around what altered states actually are. They are not windows into other dimensions. They are not most likely glimpses of some separately existing astral realm. They are variations on the same process your brain runs every moment of every day. What makes them feel so foreign is that the ordinary version runs so smoothly, we forget it is running at all. We think we are looking at the world. We are in fact looking at a remarkably well-fitted model of the world, one that has been polished over millions of years of evolutionary pressure to be just accurate enough, just fast enough, and just stable enough to keep us from being eaten, starved, or pushed off cliffs. The model is a marvel. It is also a prison of sorts, because its very tightness ensures that huge swaths of what might be available to experience never make it through. The doors Huxley wanted to open are the doors that keep the model tight, and it turns out the hinges are chemical. To see why any of this matters for the broader story we're telling, we need to bring in one more scientist and zoom out again from the individual perceptual event to the structure of consciousness itself. His name is Robin Carhart Harris, and he has spent most of his career trying to answer one question, which is what actually happens inside a human brain when it takes a serious dose of a classical psychedelic. He has done this the hard way. By putting people in brain scanners, giving them psilocybin or LSD, and watching in real time what changes, his lab has produced some of the most striking neuroimaging results of the last 2 decades. And out of all that data, he extracted a hypothesis that, depending on who you ask, is either a small addition to cognitive neuroscience or a quiet revolution. He called it the entropic brain hypothesis, and to understand it, we get to take our earlier detour into thermodynamics and finally put it to work. Carhart Harris noticed, looking at the scan data, that something specific happened to the patterns of activity in the brain under psilocybin. The activity became less predictable. Not chaotic in the sense of random noise, but varied in a particular mathematical way that physicists and complexity theorists recognized immediately. The scans showed higher entropy, more potential states, more configurations that the brain was, moment to moment, slipping through. Under normal conditions, the brain tends to settle into relatively stable patterns, returning again and again to a limited set of neural configurations. Under psilocybin, those patterns loosened. The brain explored a wider portion of its possibility space, and crucially, the subjective intensity of the participants' experiences correlated with how much the entropy had increased. More wandering through the possibility space, more profound the trip. The mathematics lined up with what people were reporting from the inside. This was, in its own quiet way, a significant scientific moment. For decades, mainstream science had treated subjective reports from people under the influence of these compounds as essentially unanalyzable. Stories about feeling merged with the universe, encountering entities, dissolving into light, hearing colours, all of it tended to be filed under the broad heading of interesting but scientifically unserious. What the imaging work did was link those subjective reports to measurable, repeatable and mathematically describable changes in brain activity. A person who said they had dissolved into everything, on closer inspection, showed specific patterns of weakened coordination in the networks that normally sustain the ongoing sense of being a bounded self. A person who reported feeling as if time had stopped showed specific shifts in the rhythmic activity of regions that normally track temporal sequence. The reports were no longer floating free, unmoored from anything a neuroscientist could point at. They had addresses, they had signatures, and the signatures were, quite strikingly, consistent from person to person. This led Carhart Harris to propose something quite elegant. Consciousness itself, he suggested, can be thought of as a spectrum, with levels of neural entropy acting as the axis. At one end of the spectrum sit states of very low entropy, deep dreamless sleep, general anesthesia, certain coma states. In these conditions, the brain is locked into a narrow range of patterns. There is not much happening. The rebellion against disorder has been dialed way down, though not so far down that you die, obviously. Just far down enough that the subjective show goes dark for a while. As you move along the spectrum toward higher entropy, you pass through dreaming sleep, where the brain is exploring a wider range of patterns and serving up those famously nonsensical nighttime features. You keep moving up through ordinary drowsy consciousness and then into regular waking awareness, which is a kind of comfortable middle zone. And then, if you keep going, you arrive at the high entropy end of the spectrum. Deep meditation, flow states, the edge of a really vivid creative breakthrough, and, at the very top, full-blown psychedelic experiences, where the brain is exploring such a wide variety of configurations that the usual sense of a single unified self can start to come apart entirely. What this implies, and this is the part that sounds almost too tidy until you see the math, is that healthy waking consciousness is not some safe average between sleep and trip. It is a particular, somewhat precarious zone that sits close to what physicists call a critical point. Critical points are places in a system where the system is poised between two different phases, neither fully one thing nor fully the other, and where tiny perturbations can produce surprisingly large effects. Water at the moment just before boiling is near a critical point. A sand pile that has grown just tall enough that the next grain might trigger an avalanche is near a critical point. Systems near criticality are peculiar. They tend to exhibit what is called scale-free or fractal organization, meaning the same kinds of patterns repeat at many different levels of zoom. A small avalanche in the sand pile looks, in its statistical structure, like a medium avalanche which looks like a large avalanche. The same recipe runs at every size. Brains, it turns out, sit right there, at the critical point. Healthy, alert, ordinary consciousness is, mathematically speaking, a brain perched on the edge of a kind of neural avalanche, where activity in a single cell can, under the right conditions, ripple outward and recruit millions of others, and where the same organizational patterns repeat from the scale of individual synapses up to the scale of entire cortical networks. This is not an accident. It is increasingly believed to be why brains work at all. A brain that sat too far on the low entropy side would be stable, efficient, and completely inflexible. It could not learn. It could not imagine. It could not handle novel situations. A brain that sat too far on the high entropy side would be endlessly creative, but also endlessly unreliable. It could not follow a line of reasoning. It could not remember where it had left its car. It could not, for that matter, maintain the basic coherence of being a single self over time. Only at the critical point does a brain get to have both stability and flexibility, both memory and imagination, both a reliable sense of self and the capacity to be surprised by a piece of music. There is a nice way to picture this. Imagine a flock of starlings, those dense rolling clouds of birds that sometimes fill the evening sky in great river-like shapes. When a flock is moving well, every bird is paying attention to a handful of its immediate neighbours, and a small adjustment by one bird at the edge can propagate across the entire flock in a fraction of a second. The flock responds as one body, yet no bird is the conductor. No single starling has the full picture. They have tuned themselves to a point where the group is neither a rigid formation nor a random scatter, and that in-between state is what makes them capable of swerving around a falcon or sculpting the sunset into those impossible ribbons. Now imagine a flock that was too tightly organized, locked into a grid. It would move stiffly, slowly, unable to react. And imagine a flock that was too loose. Each bird flying independently with no attention to the others. It would not be a flock at all, just a few hundred individual birds colliding and scattering. Your brain, at any given conscious moment, is the well-flown version of that flock. Every neuron is listening to its neighbours just closely enough to form patterns, and just loosely enough that new patterns can emerge when the situation calls for it. The experience of being you is the view from inside that flock, watching, somehow, from nowhere and everywhere at once. To get a feel for what criticality means, think about what you're doing right now. You're following a line of argument that weaves through entropy, 18th century mathematics, the colour of a dress, and brain scans of people on psilocybin. Somehow you are holding all of this together. You're remembering what was said a few minutes ago. You're integrating it with what is being said now. You're probably running, in the background, a half-aware comparison with things you have read or seen elsewhere. You're maintaining a sense of yourself as the person who is following the argument. If any of these threads broke loose and ran away on its own, the whole experience would collapse. If all of them fused into a single locked pattern, nothing new could come in. The fact that you are, at this moment, doing all of this with no apparent effort is a testament to the almost ridiculous precision of the balance your brain is striking. It is dancing on a knife's edge. It does so for most of every day you're awake, and most of us never notice. You can catch occasional glimpses of what happens when the balance shifts a little in either direction. When you're exhausted and slipping towards sleep, and a strange thought drifts through your head that doesn't quite follow from anything before it. That is your brain edging toward the higher entropy zone where dreaming lives. When you are fully absorbed in a task that demands your total focus, and an hour goes by without you noticing, and afterward you feel oddly refreshed. That is your brain briefly tightening up toward the more ordered end of the spectrum, narrowing its configurations down to the ones that serve the task at hand. Everyday life is already a constant gentle sliding up and down the entropy axis, though the sliding is small, and you stay, almost always, reasonably close to the sweet spot. What psychedelics do in this framework is push the slider much further toward the high entropy end than the brain would normally allow, and they do it quickly, and they do it for several hours, and they do not ask permission. The implications of this ripple outward in a lot of directions, and we'll be following several of those ripples in the chapters to come. But two of them are worth flagging here, because they reframe a lot of what you might already think you know about altered states. The first is that the profundity of the psychedelic experience is not, in this model, evidence that the person has contacted something outside themselves. It is evidence that their brain has temporarily moved into a region of its possibility space where it doesn't usually go, and in doing so has accessed configurations that produce experiences of extraordinary novelty, meaning, and connection. Whether those experiences correspond to anything metaphysically real is a separate question, and Carhart-Harris, being a careful scientist, tends to leave it on the shelf for philosophers to dust. What he can say is that the brain is doing something real, measurable, and unusual, and that the subjective reports match the neural patterns in ways that are, themselves, quietly remarkable. The second implication is more personal, and it hints at why this work has attracted so much attention from clinicians trying to treat stubborn mental illness. If ordinary consciousness sits at a critical point, then there are ways a brain can get stuck a little too far on the low entropy side. Not locked in coma, of course, just slightly too rigid, a little too committed to a narrow set of patterns, a brain that keeps returning to the same loop of self-critical thoughts, a brain that cannot stop expecting the worst, a brain that sees threats in ambient signals and responds with a level of defensive rigidity that, in its original context, might have been useful, but has long since outlived its purpose. Those are not metaphors. They are descriptions of specific patterns of neural activity that have become too stable, too well worn, too deep a groove to climb out of by ordinary means. And a compound that temporarily pushes the brain toward higher entropy, if administered carefully, in the right setting, with the right support, can do something that ordinary effort cannot quite manage. It can loosen the groove, just enough, just long enough to let the person see, from a slightly different angle, what they had become. We're not quite ready to get into the clinical side of the story yet. There is too much still to unpack about how this brain, this finely balanced prediction engine perched at its critical point, came to be so prone to getting stuck in the first place. Why, if the default setting of a healthy human mind is poised flexibility, do so many of us spend so much of our lives slightly too tight, slightly too anxious, slightly too certain of the wrong things? To answer that, we have to look at a specific piece of neural real estate that seems to do more than its fair share of the stuffing us into grooves, a network of regions that, depending on how it is behaving, can be either the quiet backbone of our sense of self or the relentless generator of the most exhausting internal monologue in the animal kingdom. But before we meet that network, and before we meet the branch of evolution that saddled us with it, it's worth sitting for a moment with what we've already seen. Your brain is a prediction engine. Your perception is a controlled hallucination. Your consciousness is a brain perched at a critical point, balancing the forces of order and disorder like a pebble on the edge of a tilting table. Every ordinary moment of your life is being assembled from priors and sensory corrections in something like real time, and the assembly is so seamless that you almost never catch the machinery at work. The machinery is good. The machinery has been selected for, across unfathomable stretches of evolutionary history, to be exactly this good. And yet, nested inside the machinery there is a dial, a receptor complex sitting quietly in your cortex, waiting for the right ligand to arrive. Pull the dial one way, and consciousness compresses. Pull it the other way, and the whole carefully built model starts to shimmer and breathe and let in light from the cracks. In the next stretch of our story, we're going to find out who built that dial, why it was built, and what happened when a handful of chemists and mystics in the middle of the 20th century figured out how to turn it. To understand why a brain perched at its critical point might end up stuck a little too far on the rigid side of the spectrum, we have to ask a slightly uncomfortable question. What is doing the sticking? Something clearly is pulling the dial toward order, toward repetition, toward grooves worn a little too deep. Something is the reason so many human beings spend so much of their adult lives feeling, on some low background channel, that they are not quite where they should be. Not quite who they should be. Running, most hours of most days, a kind of internal weather report of small complaints, scheduled anxieties, and recycled regrets. Something, in other words, is the engine of the ordinary modern mood. And it turns out that something has a name, a history, and, increasingly, an address in the brain. But before we can meet it on those terms, it helps to meet it the way an earlier generation of thinkers tried to, when the only instruments they had were words and the careful observation of their own unravelings. In 1929, a thoughtful, cigar-fond Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud sat down to write what would become one of the most influential essays of the 20th century, a short, grumpy, magnificent piece of work called Civilization and Its Discontents. Freud had spent decades listening to the troubles of his patients, most of them well-dressed residents of a city that was, at that moment, sliding toward a catastrophe no one quite wanted to name. He had watched what people did when they thought no one was listening. He had taken notes, and by the late 1920s he had arrived at a conclusion that was, for its time, deeply unfashionable. Being a civilized human being, he argued, came with a built-in cost, not a small cost. Paid once and forgotten. A continuous, daily, low-level tax on happiness that no amount of cleverness could fully escape. Civilization required restraint. Restraint required the suppression of impulses, and suppressed impulses, in Freud's vocabulary, did not simply disappear. They went somewhere. They festered. They returned in various disguises, and the ordinary adult going about an ordinary day was in effect carrying a small interior war around with them, mostly unaware of the combatants but constantly paying the bill. Freud mapped this war across 3 rough regions of the psyche, each with a name borrowed from Latin because naturally, psychoanalysis could not resist a little Latin. There was the id, which was the engine room of raw pre-verbal urge, hunger, desire, anger, the shapeless demand for pleasure now. There was the superego, which was the internalized courtroom of rules, expectations, and moral judgments, absorbed largely from parents and society during childhood, and installed as a kind of permanent background critic. And between them, bruised and forever negotiating, was the ego. Freud's ego was not the puffed-up thing we mean today when we call someone egotistical. It was the exhausted middle manager of the mind trying to keep the id quiet enough to avoid scandal, and the superego pleased enough to avoid guilt, while also, somehow, dealing with the external world. A thankless job, poorly paid, no hope of retirement. Most neurotic suffering, Freud thought, came from this arrangement wearing down. The negotiations broke, the id leaked, the superego thundered, the ego developed symptoms, and in walked the patient asking what was wrong. Now, a century has passed since Freud set that framework down in print, and a great deal of what he wrote has not aged especially well. Much of the specific content, the fixations, the dream interpretations, the confident pronouncements about what a particular cigar did or did not symbolize, has been quietly set aside by contemporary psychology. But the core intuition, the idea that adult consciousness is a negotiated settlement rather than a natural harmony, has turned out to be remarkably durable. You can find versions of it in cognitive science, in evolutionary psychology, in contemplative traditions from a dozen cultures. The vocabulary changes. The central observation persists. There is something about the specific shape of the human mind that makes it prone to being divided against itself, in ways that other animals, so far as we can tell, simply are not. A dog does not appear to spend the afternoon worrying about whether it was too forward with the dog next door. A pigeon does not replay arguments from 3 years ago on a loop. A deer, when it is not busy being a deer, is, by all available evidence, just being a deer. Human beings, by contrast, can carry their worst moments around for decades, repolishing them in the dark like cursed jewels. Which brings us to Robin Carhart Harris, and to an idea that takes Freud's intuition and pushes it somewhere Freud could not have gone, because the tools did not yet exist. Carhart Harris has suggested, drawing on neuroscience, anthropology, and a careful reading of a lot of mystical literature, that the specific flavour of self-consciousness we experience as adult human beings is not a cosmic constant. It is not the default setting of minds. It is not, in fact, even especially ancient. It is a relatively recent evolutionary development, possibly as recent as a few 100,000 years, and certainly intensified in the last 10,000 or so. It came in with the expansion of the neocortex, that outermost wrinkled layer of the brain where most of the planning, language, self-modelling and abstract thinking happens, and it probably cemented itself into its current, rather intense form during one of the largest transformations our species has ever made to its own way of living. The shift from a world where we followed food to a world where we grew it. To appreciate how big that shift was, it helps to zoom out. For the vast majority of human existence, our ancestors lived by hunting, gathering, fishing, and moving. Not grinding subsistence necessarily, though it had its hard seasons. More often, by the evidence we have, a mobile life in small bands, working perhaps a few hours a day for the food you needed, and spending the rest of your time doing the things humans do when they are not under relentless pressure. Telling stories, napping, grooming, arguing, making small objects, staring at fires. Whatever the inner experience of those lives looked like, it was almost certainly different from the inner experience of someone reading or listening to this right now, because the fundamental relationship with the world was different. You did not own the land. You did not control the weather. You did not store up tomorrow in the form of coins. You walked through a world that was shared, mostly unpredictable, and animated by forces much larger than you. Your sense of self, if we can even use that phrase in its modern register, was deeply embedded in that larger pattern. You were a participant in the flow, not the engineer of it. Anthropologists who have spent time with the few remaining communities that still practice something close to this older way of life report, with striking consistency, that certain modern afflictions seem largely absent in those settings. Not every misery, obviously. Human life anywhere includes grief, conflict, illness, and loss. But the specific texture of chronic anxiety about the future, of the nagging sense that one's time is being wasted, of the slow erosion of meaning in the absence of constant novelty, does not appear to be a universal human condition. It appears to be, at least in significant part, the signature of a specific kind of economy and the specific kind of inner life that economy cultivates. This is not to romanticize the past or pretend that foragers lived in paradise. They did not. They got sick. They went hungry. They died young by modern standards. But their relationship with time, with land, and with each other was organized along lines so different from ours that comparisons tend to say as much about the person making the comparison as about either way of life. What we can say, with some confidence, is that the forms of psychological suffering that fill contemporary clinics were not always the universal background music of the human condition. Something changed the station. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, something began to shift. In a handful of places around the world, in the Fertile Crescent, in parts of China, in what is now Mexico, and eventually elsewhere, human beings started doing something quietly revolutionary. They started keeping seeds. They started planting them in the same patches of ground year after year. They started, in effect, betting on the future. This is the agricultural revolution, and if you have read any modern popular history of humanity, you have probably encountered the case that it was, in many ways, a disaster for the individual human being. Diets narrowed, diseases concentrated, hours of labour per calorie actually went up for most of the people doing the labour. But the species, as a species, exploded. Populations grew. Permanent settlements became cities. Cities became kingdoms. Kingdoms became the long, tangled mess of what we now call recorded history. And inside all of that structural change, something happened to the human mind that we are still learning to articulate. Control, in Carhart Harris's telling, is the key word. The ability to control food, to plant it, to store it, to defend the store from neighbours and rodents and weather, required the development of a specific kind of cognition. You had to be able to project yourself forward in time, to imagine next spring and the one after that, to hold, in your head, a future version of yourself who would be hungry if certain present actions were not taken, to plan, to defer, to measure, to decide with increasing precision what was yours and what was not. This is a cognitive skill set that our hunter-gatherer ancestors certainly possessed in embryonic form, but it is one that agriculture cultivated, rewarded, and magnified to a degree no previous way of life had done. Over generations, the people whose minds were better at this kind of careful, future-oriented self-management passed on more of their cultural practices and perhaps, in smaller ways, their genetic dispositions. A species that had been, for hundreds of thousands of years, primarily a creature of the present began, slowly, to become something else. A creature of the anticipated, a creature of the stored, a creature of the calendar. And here is the philosophical crank in the whole machinery. Once you learn to control the granary, you start learning to control everything else. Your neighbours, if they seem inclined to raid. Your children, if they seem inclined to wander off. Your animals, once you have domesticated them. Your own inner life, once you have developed a strong enough sense of who you are and who you ought to be, the habit of control, honed on wheat and barley, generalized. It became a general-purpose mental setting, and over the course of a few thousand years it produced a kind of mind that would have been entirely unfamiliar to a hunter-gatherer from the same species, even though biologically the two were nearly indistinguishable. The new kind of mind was, among other things, chronically aware of itself. It watched itself. It rehearsed itself. It ranked itself against others. It worried about being seen. It cared, in a new and intense way, about ownership and outcome and legacy and reputation. It was, in short, the kind of mind that would eventually build pyramids, write epics, and invent the stock market. It was also the kind of mind that would lie awake at 4 a.m, for no good reason, running a film reel of things it had said wrong in the 3rd grade. You can see the fingerprints of this shift in the oldest surviving laws. The earliest legal codes we have from Mesopotamia and Egypt and eventually spreading outward across the ancient world are preoccupied with ownership. Who owns the field? Who owns the ox? What happens if your ox gores your neighbour's ox? What compensation is owed if a labourer breaks a pot? These may sound dry, but they are the record of a species learning, in writing, to nail down the edges of itself and its stuff. A hunter-gatherer band did not need a detailed legal code about oxen, because the band did not own oxen, or fields, or pots in any comparable sense. Ownership, as a pervasive category, was a new idea, and once invented it required an ever-growing scaffolding of rules, measurements, and enforcement to maintain, and the scaffolding once up reshaped the inner life of the people who lived inside it. They began to think of themselves in terms that echoed the legal categories around them, a self with its own boundaries, a self with property, rights, obligations, a self that could be wronged, insulted, cheated, a self that had to be defended, sometimes to the death, from threats that might not even have been visible to their ancestors. Now, human beings being what they are, this shift did not go unnoticed by the people living through it. In fact, some of the oldest written documents in the world seem to be, at least in part, attempts to make sense of what had happened. Almost every culture that left us written records from the ancient Near East has a version of a certain kind of story. A story about a moment in the distant past when humanity lived in some condition of simpler, more direct participation in life, and about a specific turning point after which that condition was lost. Sometimes the loss is described as a punishment. Sometimes it is described as a choice. Sometimes it is described as an inevitability, the way a grown child can never again be an infant. But the pattern is so widespread, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to indigenous origin stories on several continents, that it is hard to read it as a coincidence. Something, the storytellers seem to be saying, happened to us, and we have not quite gotten over it. The most famous version of this story, for anyone raised in a culture shaped by the Abrahamic traditions, is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, from the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. It is a story that has been preached, painted, carved, debated, ridiculed, and misquoted for roughly 3,000 years, which makes it a little hard to read fresh. Most people in the contemporary West know it only in the broadest outline, filtered through childhood religious instruction, or more likely through vague cultural osmosis. There was a garden, there was a man and a woman, there was a snake, there was an apple. Someone messed up. They got kicked out. Curtain down. This is, unfortunately, about as useful a summary as saying that Hamlet is a story about a Danish guy with a skull. There is a lot more going on in those few paragraphs of ancient text than the cartoon version suggests, and if you read it with the shift we have just been describing in mind, it starts to look suspiciously like a mythological snapshot of that same shift. Not a historical report, a compressed symbolic account of something the people who first told the story could feel had happened to their species, even if they did not have the vocabulary of archaeology or cognitive neuroscience to explain what it was. Consider the setup. In the beginning of the story, the human pair lives in a garden where everything they need is provided. They do not farm, they do not worry, they do not plan for winter, they do not notably feel self-conscious. The text specifically says they were naked and unashamed, which is a small, easy-to-skip detail that turns out to be carrying an enormous amount of weight. Shame requires a very particular cognitive setup. You have to be able to imagine yourself being seen. You have to have a model of yourself as an object in somebody else's mind. You have to be running, somewhere in the background, a little simulator of how you appear from the outside, and comparing that simulated appearance to some standard. A creature that cannot do this does not feel shame. It feels a lot of other things, but not that. So when the story insists that the first humans were unashamed, it is in effect making a very specific claim about the kind of inner life they had. They were not, in the modern sense, self-conscious. They were just there, being, like any other animal in any other field. Then comes the crucial event. The couple is instructed not to eat from a specific tree, which is identified as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The instruction itself is interesting, because it suggests that such knowledge is a thing one could acquire or not acquire, and that acquiring it would change something about the eater. Along comes the snake, whose role in the story is less villainous than most children's Bible illustrations suggest. In the original text, the snake is described as crafty, and it makes a fairly reasonable philosophical case. Eat this, it says, and your eyes will be opened. You will be, in a real sense, changed. You will know things you currently do not know. The couple eats. And the very first thing that happens, the immediate consequence the text singles out before anything else, is that they notice they are naked and are embarrassed about it. The self-model has switched on. The little simulator in the background has started running. The creature that was just there is now, for the first time, a creature that is aware of being there and has opinions about it. Everything else in the story, the fig leaves, the hiding, the excuses offered to the deity, the expulsion from the garden, the need to sweat for their food, the long painful march of human history, follows from that one moment of switching on. It is hard to overstate how neatly this story matches the cognitive shift we were just describing, even though the authors of Genesis had no way of knowing about predictive brains or default networks or agricultural revolutions in the archaeological sense. They could feel the shape of what had happened, even without the vocabulary. Eating from the tree of knowledge is, among other things, the moment at which the human creature becomes capable of reflecting on itself, and reflecting on oneself turns out to be a mixed inheritance. On one side, it lets you do everything that has made human civilization possible. Planning, inventing, building, writing, remembering the past in detail, imagining a future in detail, loving specific people as specific people rather than as generic sources of warmth. On the other side, it gives you an inner observer who never turns off, an observer who watches you fail, who compares you to others, who reminds you that you will, one day, not exist. Adam and Eve do not just get kicked out of a garden in that story. They get kicked out of a particular kind of consciousness, the consciousness of simply being in the flow of life with no running commentary. And neither they nor any of their descendants ever quite figures out how to get back in, no matter how hard they try. Scholars of comparative religion have pointed out for a long time that this pattern repeats across unrelated traditions, which is exactly the kind of pattern that makes anthropologists sit up a little straighter. In the oldest surviving Sumerian texts, the wild man Enkidu, a creature of the fields who eats grass with the gazelles and runs with the animals, is drawn into human society by a specific experience that awakens his self-consciousness, after which the animals flee from him and he can never return to their company. In Greek mythology, humanity originally lives in a golden age during the reign of Kronos, where food is abundant, labour is unnecessary, and people live in a kind of extended childhood, until a succession of cosmic events ends that era and ushers in the age of iron and effort we still inhabit. In certain Taoist texts, the sages speak of a primordial time when humans lived in unself-conscious harmony with the cosmos, before the invention of the categories of good and bad, right and wrong, ruler and subject, began to fracture the seamless experience of being. None of these traditions were borrowing from each other, as far as we can tell, at least not in their earliest layers. They were independently arriving at the intuition that something large had happened to the human inner life at some point in the distant past, and that the thing which had happened was in some sense a trade, more capability for more loneliness, more cleverness for more doubt, knowledge for something the language of knowledge cannot quite name. Reading the story this way makes a lot of the little details snap into unexpected focus. The curse that immediately follows the expulsion specifies that the man will work the ground with painful effort, and that the ground will yield its fruit only grudgingly. This is a stunningly accurate description of what actually happened when human beings transitioned from gathering to agriculture. The work got harder, the diet got narrower, the relationship with food became a continuous labour. The woman, in a detail that reflects both biological reality and a certain patriarchal culture, is told that childbirth will be painful, which given the actual dimensions of a human baby's skull is unfortunately true regardless of culture. But the subtler curse, the one no archaeologist can excavate and no doctor can treat, is the one buried in the act of eating the fruit itself. They will know now. They will see themselves from the outside. They will measure and compare and worry and want and fear. They will be the sort of beings who can produce Shakespeare and also the sort of beings who can produce existential dread at 3 in the morning when they should be sleeping. The package deal is not negotiable. The knowledge does not come with an uninstall option. This is, if you will forgive the phrase, a remarkably honest piece of mythology. It does not pretend that the shift to self-consciousness was purely a gain. It does not pretend the lost state of being without commentary was purely a loss either, because without the shift we would not have the story itself, let alone the cultures capable of treasuring it for millennia. It tells the ambivalent truth. We became more capable and more miserable at the same time, by the same act, and the capability and the misery are the same thing looked at from different angles. Almost every serious contemplative tradition that arose in the wake of the agricultural revolutions, from the Upanishads in India to the Buddhist suttas to the desert fathers of early Christianity to the Sufi poets of the Islamic world, has taken some version of this situation as its starting point. We have, as a species, acquired a remarkable instrument, the reflective self-conscious mind. We have also acquired, alongside it, a specific kind of suffering that other animals do not appear to share. Every tradition then proposes, in its own vocabulary, some strategy for working with the instrument more wisely. Not by smashing it, which would be impossible anyway, but by loosening our identification with it. By learning, through practice, to rest in something deeper than the running commentary. Carhart Harris, being a modern scientist rather than a contemplative teacher, puts the same insight in more neutral language. The ego, he suggests, is a specific pattern in the brain. It is not an illusion in the dismissive sense, the way a rainbow is sometimes called an illusion. It is a real, functional, highly useful piece of cognitive machinery. It is the neural system that keeps track of you as a continuous agent across time, the thing that remembers yesterday was you and expects tomorrow to be you as well. Without it, we would have no autobiographical memory, no long-term planning, no sense of personal responsibility, no enduring relationships. Life as we know it would be impossible, but the same machinery, when it runs a little too hot, when it grips a little too tight, produces the kind of mental weather that most human beings, most of the time, simply accept as the cost of being awake. Chronic self-referential thinking, endless rumination about the past, endless rehearsal of the future, the persistent background sense that you're separate from everything else, that you're a small, vulnerable, bounded thing looking out at a vast, indifferent world, that you have to, somehow, protect yourself from the rest of existence. The tricky part, which every contemplative tradition has had to grapple with in its own way, is that this same self-model is also what does the grappling. The ego is the tool that notices the ego is the problem. It is the hand trying to grasp itself, which is why direct effort to dismantle it tends to produce, at best, a slightly different ego that now considers itself to be working on the ego. Most traditional practices developed over centuries precisely because the obvious strategies did not work. You cannot simply decide to stop being self-conscious, any more than you can simply decide to stop noticing a song once it is stuck in your head. The self-model has momentum. It has habits. It has been practicing itself for your entire adult life. Loosening it, even briefly, requires either long years of specialized training or, as Huxley suspected, and as modern research has begun to confirm, a temporary chemical intervention that bypasses the usual routes and acts directly on the machinery. Neither approach is casual, neither is a shortcut in any meaningful sense, but both are, at bottom, attempts at the same thing. A way of loosening the grip so that some portion of the experience can be tasted even briefly from a different angle. Huxley had his own phrase for this. He called it, in various places, the self-enclosed island of the ego. He came back to it again and again in his writings, particularly in the later years of his life, and it was precisely that island he was trying to escape when he drank that small glass of water in the Hollywood garden in the spring of 1953. He understood, intuitively and from long study, that the feeling of being a separate self cut off from everything else was both the defining texture of modern adult life and, somehow, the central trouble of it. Not the cause of all particular miseries, obviously. People get sick, lose loved ones, face real external hardships, and those are real. But underneath even the hardest external circumstances, he thought, ran a quieter, more general unease, a feeling of being locked out of something, of being, in some way that was difficult to name, alienated from the texture of life itself. He did not think this feeling was natural in the sense of being inevitable. He thought it was natural in the sense of being what a particular kind of mind produced when left to its own devices, and he wanted very badly to find a door back. Huxley was not alone in naming this quality of modern experience. Writers and poets had been circling it for at least a century by the time he came to it. The English Romantics had written about it under the heading of a lost sense of wonder, the feeling that the industrial age had drained colour from the world. The French and German existentialists of the early 20th century had written about it under the headings of absurdity and angst, the suspicion that the modern self stood alone in an indifferent universe with no inherited meaning to lean on. American transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau had gone to the woods to try to shake it off with only partial success. There was, across the cultural landscape Huxley inherited, a persistent sense that something central had been misplaced, and a recurring suspicion that whatever it was could not be retrieved simply by reading more books about it. He read the books anyway. He read enormous stacks of them. But by the early 1950s he had come to the conclusion that the problem was not cognitive in the ordinary sense. It was experiential. It was, if the word can be rescued from decades of vague spiritual bookshop use, a problem of direct knowing, and direct knowing was exactly what the ordinary apparatus of adult Western cognition was so efficient at suppressing. What he did not yet know, and what modern neuroscience has only recently begun to map, is that the self-enclosed island has a neural signature. The specific feeling of being a distinct, separate, narrating self has specific brain correlates. It is associated with a particular network of interconnected regions that tend to light up together, reliably, in fMRI studies, whenever a person is not focused on a specific external task. Daydreaming, mind-wandering, thinking about yourself, thinking about what other people think of you, running scenarios about the future, replaying scenes from the past. All of it is subserved by a specific piece of neural machinery, one that did not even have a name until the early 2000s. When a careful neuroscientist noticed that some regions of the brain were strangely more active during rest than during effortful tasks, which was not supposed to happen according to the textbooks. That observation set off a small revolution in how we think about the brain's default settings, and it gave us a physical address for the island Huxley had spent so much of his life trying to leave. Which is where this story, in the stretch ahead, is going to take us next. Not out of the garden, into the specific patch of neural real estate that, for better and for worse, is the reason we can't find our way back to it on our own. The story of how we found the physical home of the ego is one of those scientific accidents that makes you love science for a moment and then slightly distrust it for a moment, in that order. It begins, as most useful accidents do, with somebody noticing something they were not supposed to be noticing. In the late 1990s, a neurologist at Washington University in St. Louis named Marcus Rachel was running a perfectly ordinary study on what happens in the brain when people perform various cognitive tasks. Puzzles, reading, mental arithmetic, the usual menu. He was using positron emission tomography, a scanning method that measures how much a given region of the brain is working at any given moment by tracking the flow of radioactive glucose. It is, in case you were wondering, as unglamorous as it sounds. You lie very still in a large metal donut while the machine quietly takes notes on what parts of your head are currently burning through the tracer someone has helpfully injected into your arm. The whole field, at that point, was organised around a perfectly reasonable assumption. Different tasks ought to activate different brain regions, and the scientist's job was to figure out which regions did what. If you wanted to study language, you had people read. If you wanted to study visual processing, you showed them pictures. Between tasks, you might let them rest for a few minutes. The resting periods were essentially filler, dead space, a baseline to compare the real data against. Nobody looked at them with any particular interest, because nothing interesting was supposed to be happening. If anything, the brain during rest was expected to be quieter, less busy, sort of on standby, like a laptop with the lid closed. Rachel, who has the kind of slightly mischievous curiosity that makes for good scientists and bad airline passengers, noticed something odd while comparing his data. Certain regions of the brain were not quieting down during those resting periods at all. They were, In fact, more active during rest than during the tasks. And it was the same set of regions over and over, across subjects, across studies, across experiments, with entirely different purposes: medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, a few other places knitted together into a recognizable pattern. Whatever these regions were doing, they were doing it most vigorously when the person in the scanner was supposedly not doing anything, which was, by the reigning assumptions of the field, supposed to be impossible. Unsurprisingly, this did not make Rachel instantly famous. For years, the finding was treated as a curiosity, a footnote, the kind of thing you politely set aside. He eventually gave it a name, the default mode of brain function, and with that name, one of the more influential discoveries in modern neuroscience quietly entered the literature. Pretending to be nothing special, there is a certain irony worth pausing on here. The brain uses an enormous amount of energy relative to its size. By weight, it is roughly 2% of the body. By metabolic demand, it burns through something like 20% of the body's total energy budget, which is why mental work, even when you are sitting still, is genuinely tiring in a way that does not feel proportional to the lack of physical activity. The reigning theory, before Rachel's observation, had been that the brain did most of this expensive work in response to specific demands, and that during rest it lowered its energy use, much as a car idling at a red light uses less fuel than one in a highway merge. What Rachel found instead was that the brain, at rest, was idling very expensively indeed. The lights were not off. They had been redirected to a different set of rooms. The brain was spending a substantial fraction of its energy budget every minute of every day on whatever it was this default network was up to. For an organ that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution to conserve metabolic resources ruthlessly, that kind of idle expenditure had to be doing something important, something the organism could not afford to skip. Naturally, figuring out what that something was became the next puzzle. Once the name existed, researchers started looking for this default mode network more deliberately, and they found it everywhere, in every neurotypical adult, in every scanning study once someone thought to look. It had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. It turned out to have a remarkable property. The regions of the network were not just individually active during rest, they were talking to each other. Their activity rose and fell together in a coordinated rhythm. They were, in the technical language, functionally connected, which is neuroscience's way of saying they behaved as if they were members of the same private conversation. And the topic of that conversation, when researchers dug into what was happening subjectively during these high default mode moments, turned out to be an interesting one. It was you. Specifically, it was you thinking about you. It was you remembering something that happened last Thursday. It was you wondering, for no particular reason, whether your coworker had seemed a little off this morning. It was you rehearsing the conversation you were going to have with the dentist tomorrow. It was you planning what to make for dinner, then second-guessing the plan, then revising it, then losing interest and drifting to a half-remembered song. It was you running an internal narrative in which you were both the main character and the person watching the main character. In short, when the default mode network lit up, the subjective content of the mind tended to be that vast, continuous stream of self-referential thought that makes up, by some estimates, something like half of our waking life. The thing we usually call mind-wandering, the thing meditation teachers have been politely telling us to notice and release for about 25 centuries. To grasp why this mattered so much, it helps to stop thinking about the network as a single thing and start thinking about what it is for. The regions that make up the default network are also, in various combinations, the regions that activate when you imagine yourself in a different time or place, when you remember a vivid scene from childhood, when you picture what your life will look like in 5 years, when you try to guess what someone else is thinking about you, when you ruminate on a past mistake, when you construct a mental story that ties together your past, your present, and some plausible future into a single continuous person named, for example, whatever your name happens to be. The default network appears to be, among other things, the substrate of the autobiographical self, the hardware on which the story of you runs. And the striking thing is how much of the day it is running the story, even when no external situation requires it. You're not consciously choosing to daydream about that awkward moment from a decade ago. You're not actively deciding to worry about next month's bill. The network serves up these small loops by default, as its name suggests. They are what the brain does when it has nothing else pressing to do, which, from a certain angle, is extraordinary. Imagine you invented a computer that, when no program was running, spontaneously generated a continuous stream of small complaints and unfinished to-do lists on its screen. You would probably send it back. You would call customer service and ask whether this was the intended feature. And the technician, if he was honest, would say, well, actually the stream is the feature. The stream is what the computer is for most of the time. All the other programs are just interruptions of the main show. That, essentially, is the situation human beings are in with respect to their default mode networks. The background hum of self-referential thought is not a bug that occasionally pops up between real activities. It is closer to the main event. It is what we are. Most of the time we're anything at all. This is where the story connects back to the neural groove we have been circling toward for several chapters now. If the ego, in the sense of the continuous self-model, is physically implemented by the default mode network, then the habits of that network are, in a very real sense, the habits of the self. A default network that tends to return over and over to the same themes, the same grievances, the same fears, the same familiar self-criticisms, produces a person whose inner life is a well-worn loop. The loop feels like them, because the network that generates the loop is also the network that generates the sense of being a someone at all. Escape from the loop feels impossible, not because it is literally impossible, but because every move one might make toward escape is organized by the same machinery that is producing the loop. It is the hand trying to grasp itself again, but now we can actually point at the hand. Carhart-Harris, who, as we have seen, has been mapping these territories carefully, has argued that the default mode network functions as a kind of orchestra conductor for the rest of the brain. Not literally waving a baton, but setting a certain rhythm and a certain pattern of coordination that other networks tend to fall in line with. When the conductor is well balanced, the orchestra produces the recognizable music of ordinary consciousness. When the conductor starts hammering the same few notes over and over, the rest of the orchestra follows, and the resulting symphony has a specific, unfortunately familiar character. The character of being stuck, of thinking the same thoughts, of coming back, again and again, to the same corner of the room no matter which door you walk through. In the vocabulary we introduced earlier, this is a brain that has shifted slightly toward the low entropy end of the consciousness spectrum. Not so far that function collapses, obviously. Far enough that flexibility is reduced, grooves deepen, novelty gets harder to register. The mental landscape develops ruts, and the ruts do what ruts always do. They attract more traffic. Carhart-Harris suggested that contemporary adult consciousness is, on average, slightly subcritical. It sits a little too far on the side of order, a little too rigid, a little too dominated by habit and expectation. For most people, most of the time, this is a barely noticeable tilt. You feel like yourself. You get through your day. Nothing is dramatically wrong. But for some people, under some circumstances, the tilt becomes more pronounced, and the rigidity begins to organize the whole experience. When that happens, the condition acquires names and clinicians start attending to it, and the person inside the condition usually describes it with a telling vocabulary. Stuck, trapped, going in circles, unable to get out of my own head. The everyday language of psychological distress is, with astonishing consistency, the language of excessive order, of a system that has lost the capacity to find new patterns, of a brain that has curled into a shape it cannot unfold by willing it to unfold. Take depression as the clearest example. One of the most striking findings in the last decade of imaging research is that depression is associated with a particular kind of overactivity in parts of the default mode network, especially the regions involved in ruminating about oneself. Depressed individuals, on average, show patterns of activity that look like the self-referential orchestra has run away with the concert. The loop of negative self-focused thought does not just play occasionally, it plays continuously, often underneath whatever the person is ostensibly doing, and it resists redirection in a way that makes ordinary advice to just think about something else land with a kind of well-meaning cruelty. The person is not failing to think about something else. They are trapped in a network configuration in which thinking about something else has become, at the neural level, genuinely difficult. Their brain has, in effect, settled into an attractor, a stable but suboptimal pattern that the system keeps returning to no matter which direction it is nudged from. This is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of willpower. It is a specific, describable configuration of a specific piece of brain machinery, and once you see it this way, the problem shifts from being a moral one to being an engineering one, which is a much more productive place to start. Obsessive-compulsive disorder presents another flavour of the same essential shape. Here the stuck loop is narrower and more specific. Certain thoughts arrive, refuse to leave, and demand specific behaviours as a way to discharge the anxiety they generate. The behaviours in turn reinforce the loop, because each completion teaches the brain that the thought was worth responding to. People living with obsessive patterns know, often acutely, that their compulsions are out of proportion to any actual danger. They know the door is locked. They know their hands are clean. They know the stove is off. The knowing does not loosen the grip, because the grip is not primarily about knowledge. It is about a neural circuit that has learned through repetition to light up in a very particular way, and will keep lighting up until something intervenes in the circuit itself. Addiction, in this framework, is a third variation, with a few additional wrinkles. Here the loop is not purely cognitive, but also deeply tied to the reward and motivation systems of the brain. A substance, or a behaviour, gets repeatedly coupled to a surge of dopamine, and after enough repetitions the brain starts treating the substance or behaviour as a central priority, often above food, sleep and relationships. The neural landscape, in a literal sense, tilts. Pathways associated with the drug of choice become deep, fast, easy to travel. Pathways associated with other sources of meaning or pleasure become shallower, slower, harder to access. The person may want earnestly to choose differently. They may agree with every intellectual argument against the addiction, and yet the landscape itself is what is making the choice difficult. It is like trying to roll a ball uphill when a much more prominent valley sits just to the side. Gravity, at every moment, pulls the ball toward the valley. Willpower can hold the ball on the hillside for a while. Willpower eventually gets tired, and the ball returns to the place the landscape has shaped for it. It is worth saying plainly, because the culture often does not, that all three of these conditions have a developmental dimension as well. Nobody is born with a deep rumination groove. The grooves form, in most cases, over years, through a combination of temperament, experience, and circumstance. A child who grows up in a household where safety is unpredictable tends to develop a nervous system that scans relentlessly for threat. A child who is criticized often develops an inner critic that keeps doing the work after the external critic is gone. A person who discovers, in a hard moment, that a particular substance reliably quiets the internal weather will, quite naturally, turn to it again when the weather returns. None of this is anyone's fault in the ordinary sense. The brain is doing what brains do. It is finding the shortest available route to reduce suffering, and it is remembering the route it found. Over time, the routes become the terrain. The terrain becomes the life. And by the time the person notices that something has gone wrong, the landscape has become so familiar that imagining a different one feels, from the inside, like imagining a different self entirely, which is in a way exactly what it would take. Notice the common thread running through these three very different conditions. They are all of them variations on the theme of excessive order, of a mental landscape in which the grooves have grown too deep, of a system that has lost its capacity to explore new configurations and keeps returning, helplessly, to the same few. Carhart-Harris's insight is that treating these conditions as problems of rigidity, rather than as isolated disease entities each with its own unique essence, opens up a specific kind of therapeutic possibility. If the problem is a brain stuck too far toward the low entropy end of the spectrum, then what the brain may need, at least periodically, is a temporary push toward higher entropy. A chance to explore configurations it has not been visiting. A loosening of the grip. Not as a permanent state, obviously, since no one wants to live in a permanent psychedelic experience, which would make parking the car a memorable adventure. But as a brief structured intervention that lets the landscape soften enough for new paths to form. This is the rationale behind the renewed clinical interest in these compounds, and it is an idea that, in theory, lines up beautifully with what the imaging data have been showing. In practice, as we'll see later, the story is more complicated, but the underlying logic is elegant and worth sitting with. It is also worth sitting with something more general. If the default mode network is the seat of the self model, and if contemporary life has a particular knack for driving that network into ever tighter grooves, then a great many features of modern existence start to look like they are, collectively, feeding the wrong wolf. Consider the design of most modern attention economies. Social platforms optimize for continuous engagement, and they do that by serving up a steady stream of triggers aimed squarely at the self model. What do other people think of you? What are other people doing that you are not doing? How do you compare? How should you feel? Every scroll is a small ping to the default network, a fresh invitation to activate the autobiographical self and measure it against something. The result, as anyone who has tried to turn off their phone for a weekend can tell you, is not relaxation but a kind of low-grade withdrawal. The network, trained for years on rapid-fire pings, has trouble tolerating silence. It gets fidgety. It starts generating its own pings to keep busy. It pulls the person back toward the device. The device delivers the next ping. The loop deepens. Nobody is choosing this in the ordinary sense, the landscape is. Or consider the default texture of office life in a wealthy country. You're expected to be reachable across multiple channels for much of the day. You're expected to produce outputs that can be measured and to worry appropriately about whether your outputs are being measured favorably. You're expected to hold in your head a running model of your own performance and how it looks from the outside. None of this is, in itself, unreasonable. Work has to get done. Somebody has to do it. But the cumulative effect on the specific piece of neural machinery we have been describing is not subtle. The default network is invited, politely but relentlessly, to run its self-evaluation routines most of the working day. Then we wonder, genuinely, why so many educated, well-resourced people report feeling burnt out, disconnected, and vaguely unhappy despite living in what is, by any historical standard, a period of remarkable material comfort. The comfort is real. The exhaustion is also real. They are not contradictions. They are cousins. Even leisure has been quietly colonized. The kind of unstructured rest that our ancestors might have spent sitting around a fire watching the stars or doing nothing particularly productive for hours at a stretch has become, for many of us, a rare experience. We fill the spaces. We listen to something during the walk. We watch something while we eat. We scroll through something while we wait. Each of these activities is perfectly fine in moderation, and some of them are wonderful, but taken together, they mean that the default network almost never gets the kind of open, undirected time in which, historically, the mind sometimes settled into quieter rhythms, daydreaming a harmless daydream, staring at nothing, letting the thoughts run out. That kind of rest, it turns out, is not a luxury. It is a piece of neural hygiene, and losing it has cost that no one shows up on a quarterly report. Huxley, watching from mid-century with the perceptiveness he brought to nearly everything, had anticipated some of this. He wrote, in various places, about a species that would eventually find itself so saturated with stimulation that genuine inner quiet became a distant memory. He did not have neuroimaging. He had novels, essays, and an unusual gift for reading cultural tendencies before they fully matured. He understood, in his own vocabulary, that a civilization organized around keeping the ego continuously busy was a civilization in which the ego would, over generations, become more and more the totality of experience, more and more what people took themselves to be, more and more the only room in the house they ever visited, and he suspected that the cost of this would be a loss that most people would not even be able to name, because the vocabulary for naming it would have atrophied along with the experience itself. This is where the default mode network, understood in the light of everything we have been tracking, starts to look less like a dry neuroscientific discovery and more like a missing piece in a very old puzzle. The contemplative traditions of the world have been describing for centuries a specific kind of suffering rooted in over-identification with the narrative self. The meditation manuals of various schools have been prescribing specific practices aimed at loosening that identification. The results of these practices have been reported in vocabularies that modern scientists, trained to roll their eyes at anything that smells of mysticism, were for a long time unable to take seriously. Then a scanner accidentally caught the network behaving strangely during rest, and other scanners caught the same network behaving differently in long-term meditators, and then other scanners caught it behaving differently under certain compounds, and piece by piece an older map and a newer map began to line up. Not perfectly, not in every detail, but enough that it is now possible to hold both in view at once, and to notice that they appear to be describing the same territory. The meditation studies in particular are worth pausing on, because they rule out a tempting misreading of the default network story. One could, on a first pass, conclude that the network is simply bad, and that the goal of a well-lived life is to turn it off as much as possible. This would be a mistake. The network is not the enemy. It is, as we said, the neural substrate of the ongoing self, without which none of us would be able to hold a conversation, honour a commitment, or recognise our own children. What imaging research on experienced meditators actually shows is not that these practitioners have shut the network off. It is that they have developed a different relationship with it. In long-term meditators, the network still activates, but its activity is more loosely coupled to certain other regions, less sticky, less prone to dragging attention into its orbit. The thoughts still arise. The meditator simply does not fall into them as deeply. It is the difference between a room where the radio is playing and you are sitting calmly in the armchair, versus a room where the radio is playing and you are, without noticing, dancing along to every song. The radio is the same. The relationship to the radio is entirely different, and decades of practice, it turns out, can slowly train the brain into that shift. This is worth knowing because it prevents a sort of reactionary misunderstanding that creeps into certain corners of the contemporary wellness conversation. The goal is not a mind without thoughts. The goal, as the older traditions put it in their various idioms, is a mind that is no longer captured by its thoughts. A self-model that still does its useful work without being mistaken for the whole of experience. The default network rebalanced, not demolished. The difference matters because the attempt to demolish the self typically backfires, producing either a very tense self pretending not to be tense, or, in more extreme cases, genuine psychological harm. What the traditions suggest, and what the neuroscience is starting to confirm, is that the route forward is softer than demolition. It is loosening, it is tuning, it is, if one wants a musical metaphor, learning to play the instrument rather than trying to throw it out the window. To bring this section to a resting point rather than a stop, it is worth saying where we now stand in the larger story. We started with a man in a garden experiencing something he described as seeing the world as if for the first time. We have, since then, built up a picture of what the ordinary brain is doing when it is not doing what Huxley was doing. It is predicting, it is filtering, it is maintaining an island of order against the pull of decay, it is running a finely tuned model of reality polished by evolution into something that keeps us alive without drowning us in information. And now we can add the specific fact that part of this ordinary activity, a large part, is organised by a particular network whose job includes the continuous maintenance of a self-model, that is, under ordinary conditions, the very thing we take ourselves to be. Loosen the maintenance, even a little, and the self-model starts to change. Loosen it a lot, and something that looks very much like what Huxley reported becomes possible, not as a fluke of chemistry, as a predictable outcome of altering the tuning on a specific piece of machinery. Which raises the obvious next question. If the machinery is so prone to deepening its own grooves, if it is so easily nudged toward rigidity by the normal pressures of a modern life, then why does the brain not have its own way of periodically loosening the grip? Why would evolution, having invented this remarkable self-model, forget to include a reset switch? The happy answer is that it did not forget. The less happy answer is that we, collectively, have spent a lot of effort during the last several thousand years making the reset switch harder and harder to find. In the next stretch of the story, we are going to locate the switch, describe how it is wired, and follow the surprisingly long human history of discovering, naming, hiding, and occasionally rediscovering it. The reset switch, it turns out, has been there all along. Tucked into the outer surface of the neocortex, the same wrinkled sheet of tissue responsible for most of our higher thinking, sits a specific class of receptor that has been doing its quiet work for a very long time. It is called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of those names only a biochemist could love, and which we will be running into often enough that it is worth getting on friendly terms with. The 5 stands for serotonin, the neurotransmitter most people have heard of even if they have only a vague sense of what it does. The HT stands for hydroxytryptamine, which is the scientific name for serotonin itself. The 2A is a family designation, because serotonin binds to at least 7 different receptor types in the brain, each with its own shape, its own distribution, and its own particular job. The 2A receptor is the one that sits densely in the neocortex, especially in the deep layers of the cortical regions responsible for self-modeling, complex cognition, and the broad integration of information across the brain. It is, if you want a slightly oversimplified image, the dial that tunes how tightly the brain clings to its own predictions. Under ordinary conditions, that dial is set conservatively. Serotonin is released in measured doses as part of the brain's normal regulatory activity. The 2A receptor responds to those measured doses in measured ways. Predictions stay tight. The self-model stays stable. The grooves, as we have seen, sometimes deepen rather more than is healthy, but the whole apparatus runs, by and large, smoothly enough that most days pass without any dramatic neurological weather. This is the arrangement evolution has settled on, presumably because an animal with a tightly stable self-model is an animal that can remember where the water is, recognize its own children, and avoid walking into the same predator twice. Stability pays rent. Stability keeps the ink tendril knitted together against the ocean of decay. Most of the time, stability is exactly what you want. It helps to appreciate just how much of the cortex is studded with these receptors. If you could stain a human brain to show the distribution, you would see the densest concentrations precisely in the regions most involved in the higher functions that make a human recognizably human. The prefrontal cortex, where long-term planning and self-regulation happen. The association areas, where information from different senses gets woven into a unified picture. The deep layers of the cortical sheet, where signals travel vertically through the processing hierarchy. In other words, the receptor is positioned exactly where you would install a dial if you wanted to regulate the overall tone of sophisticated cognitive life. It is not a peripheral system tucked away in some obscure corner of the brainstem. It is wired into the main stage. Which tells us something important. Whatever this receptor is doing, the brain considers it central enough to put it where the action is. But here is where evolution, being far cleverer than the organisms it shapes, installed a small but crucial exception. There are circumstances under which the ordinarily useful stability becomes a liability. Circumstances in which the current internal model is so badly matched to the current external situation that continuing to run the old model would kill the organism. A desert that should have produced rain and did not. A prolonged famine that is eating through the usual coping strategies. A social catastrophe that has dismantled the community on which a person's whole sense of identity depended. In those extreme circumstances, the usual relationship between prediction and reality is broken down, and clinging tighter to the old predictions is no longer adaptive. What the organism needs in such moments is something very different. It needs the ability to loosen the model, admit a wider range of possibilities, and consider configurations of thought, behavior, and social arrangement it would never otherwise entertain. It needs, in other words, a temporary push toward higher entropy. A brief visit to the other end of the spectrum, and evolution, after a few 100 million years of tinkering, built a way to deliver exactly that. The way it built it is elegant. Under conditions of severe and sustained stress, the body's serotonin system, among other things, shifts its behavior. The 2A receptors become more active. The ordinary dampening that keeps them quiet lifts, even slightly, and the cortex starts to loosen its grip on its own confident predictions. Not always dramatically, not into full-blown altered states, usually just enough that the mind becomes, in a particular way, more open, more fluid, more willing to consider the unthinkable. Psychologists have noticed for a long time that people who have survived genuine crises often report changes afterwards, sometimes profound ones. A narrow certainty they carried for years suddenly softens. A relationship they had been tolerating becomes unbearable. A career path they had never questioned loses its pull. Something has reorganized. And while the specific mechanisms are still being worked out, a growing body of research suggests that this class of receptor is at the heart of why crisis, when it does not destroy a person, so often remakes them. Carhart-Harris has a phrase for these episodes that is worth adopting, because it captures the shape of the thing better than the clinical vocabulary tends to. He calls them pivotal mental states. The word pivotal is chosen carefully. These are not merely bad moods, or passing disturbances, or ordinary emotional reactions. They are moments in which the whole trajectory of a mind can turn. Before the state, the person is one kind of person, running one kind of internal model. During the state, the model becomes unusually plastic, unusually open to revision. After the state, the person may emerge holding beliefs, values, and priorities that are quite different from the ones they went in with. Not always in beneficial directions, obviously. Some pivotal states deepen despair. Some break people rather than reshaping them. But the neural conditions that make such drastic reshaping possible at all seem to cluster around this same cortical switch. It is, in effect, a built-in emergency feature. a small evolutionary provision for cases where the old map has run out of territory and a new map is required. The practical implication of the pivotal state framing is quietly radical. It suggests that the difference between a life-altering breakthrough and a psychological collapse may not lie in the intensity of the underlying experience, which can be quite similar in both cases, but in the conditions surrounding it. The same neurochemical open window can support either outcome depending on what is available to the person when they walk through it. Support, guidance, safety, a framework of meaning, time for integration. When these are present, the plasticity can be used to reshape a life in durable, health-promoting ways. When they are absent, the same plasticity can produce a person who emerges destabilized, unmoored, sometimes worse off than they were before. This is why the traditions that use these kinds of states carefully, whatever their specific vocabulary, paid enormous attention to context. They had learned, usually at great cost, that opening the window was the easy part. Closing it well and helping the person integrate what had come through was the difficult work that made the whole practice worthwhile. Once you know what to look for, you can see the hand of this mechanism at work throughout human history and across cultures, long before anyone had the vocabulary to describe it. Every society that has survived any length of time has developed techniques, rituals or practices that reliably push the mind into altered states, and the techniques turn out on inspection to cluster around a fairly consistent set of methods. Fasting, prolonged exposure to cold or heat, sleep deprivation, social isolation, rhythmic drumming, sustained dancing, chanting, breath control, physical ordeal, silence, darkness. None of these are random. Each of them, in its own way, places the body and the brain under the kinds of stresses that appear to engage the same serotonin machinery we have been describing. Each of them is, at a neurochemical level, knocking on the same door, and each of them, in the traditions where it is practiced, is understood to be a path toward experiences that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to catch up with. Consider fasting, which is perhaps the most widespread of these practices. Almost every major religious tradition incorporates fasting in some form, and across very different theological frameworks the rationale converges. Fasting, practitioners report, quiets the ordinary noise of the mind. It sharpens perception. It tends, after the initial discomfort passes, to produce a specific kind of clarity in which priorities rearrange themselves. Long fasts can produce states of heightened sensitivity that resemble, in their phenomenology, the earlier phases of certain psychedelic experiences. None of this is mysterious. Prolonged caloric restriction is one of the classic triggers for the cortical plasticity states we have been describing. The body, sensing that resources are low and that the current situation requires reassessment, shifts into a mode in which the mind itself becomes more malleable. The traditions that codified fasting as a spiritual practice were, in effect, harnessing a physiological fact and building an entire framework of meaning around it. And the framework generally worked, which is why the practices kept getting passed down. Now we come to the techniques that work through rhythm, and these are among the most fascinating because they are so ancient and so universal. Drumming, chanting, dancing, and the various forms of rhythmic breath control appear in nearly every culture on the planet, from the ceremonies of Amazonian tribes to the whirling practices of Sufi orders to the curtains of Hindu devotion to the ecstatic choruses of Pentecostal churches. The instruments differ, the specific rhythms differ, the theological interpretations could not be more different. But the underlying activity, sustained rhythmic input to the nervous system over long enough periods, produces a remarkably consistent set of effects. Heart rate and breathing entrain to the rhythm. Ordinary thought loops begin to loosen their grip. A sense of merging with the group or with something beyond the group often arises. In certain well-documented cases, practitioners move into full trance states in which the ordinary sense of a bounded, narrating self becomes notably attenuated. Brain imaging of practitioners during these activities shows exactly the kind of shifts in default network activity we have been discussing in other contexts. The drums are, in their own way, another knock on the same door. Breath control deserves a brief spotlight of its own. Across traditions, various forms of regulated or intensified breathing have been used to produce altered states. Yogic pranayama, certain Buddhist practices, shamanic hyperventilation techniques. More recently, the synthesized versions that circulate in contemporary therapeutic settings, where forms of holotropic breathwork attempt to produce similar states without pharmacological help. The physiology is interesting. Changes in breathing rhythm and depth shift the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood, which in turn affects blood flow to the brain, which in turn affects the patterns of cortical activity. With the right rhythm, sustained for long enough, the brain can be pushed into configurations that otherwise require drugs, crisis, or many years of meditation practice to reach. The fact that something as basic as how you breathe can do this to your nervous system is, on reflection, one of the more underappreciated facts about being alive. It also tells us something revealing about the architecture of the system. Breath is almost unique among bodily functions in being both automatic and voluntary. You do not have to think about it, but you can choose to. Most other core processes, your heart rate, your digestion, the timing of your immune response run entirely below the level of conscious access. Breath sits at the interface, half under the control of ancient brainstem circuits and half available to conscious steering. This accident of evolution has turned out to be enormously useful, because it means that a human being has a direct, always accessible lever on their own nervous system state. Slowing the breath triggers a cascade of calming effects through the parasympathetic system. Speeding and deepening it pushes the body towards states of heightened arousal, and under the right conditions, with practiced technique, the breath can be used to push the brain all the way into the plasticity territory we keep circling. The traditions that treat the breath as sacred were, in their own vocabulary, noticing that this lever was always within reach, if you knew what to do with it. What all of these practices have in common, aside from the fact that they predate written history and show up wherever human beings gather in stable communities, is that they are stressors. Not stressors in the modern, phone-buzzing, deadline-looming sense. Stressors in the older biological sense, meaning challenges that engage the body's adaptive system strongly enough to produce a response. The response, in each case, includes shifts in serotonin activity and, more specifically, shifts at the same cortical receptor we keep circling back to. The body reads the challenge and releases in carefully modulated ways the chemical signals that tell the cortex to loosen up and consider revising its model. This is why the traditions work. They are not arbitrary cultural inventions. They are in effect folk neurochemistry, refined over generations by trial and error, and preserved because the results were useful. The crucial point, and the reason this chapter matters for everything that follows, is that the classical psychedelics accomplish the same thing by a much more direct route. LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, and the other molecules in this family all share a particular property. They fit into the 5-HT2A receptor and activate it. Not perfectly, not identically. Each has its own profile of binding, its own subtle variations in how strongly it prefers certain receptor subtypes over others, its own duration, its own character. But the core action, the common thread that makes them all members of the same pharmacological family, is their intimate relationship with that one specific receptor. They are, at a molecular level, shaped to slot into the exact dial that evolution installed as the emergency reset. And when they do, the dial turns, the grip loosens, the cortex enters, pharmacologically, the kind of plasticity state that fasting, isolation, drumming, and all the traditional techniques had been reaching for the long way around. This framing helps resolve a question that bothers many thoughtful people when they first encounter the psychedelic literature. If these compounds can produce such profound experiences, why are they so often treated as fringe or dangerous, when contemplative practices aimed at similar destinations are generally regarded as wholesome? The answer is not that one is real and the other is fake. Both are real. The difference lies in the root. The traditional practices require time, commitment, and crucially, a social context that supports their use. You do not decide to do a 40-day fast alone in your apartment on a Wednesday. You do it within a tradition, with guidance, with preparation, and with people around you who understand what you are attempting. The practices have built-in slowness, which gives the mind time to integrate what it encounters as it encounters it. The classical psychedelics, by contrast, deliver the chemical activation directly and quickly, often within an hour, and sustain it for hours at a dose much higher than what the endogenous system would ordinarily produce. The experience is more concentrated, the window of plasticity is more dramatic, and consequently, the need for a supportive framework around the experience is, if anything, greater, not less. The tool is powerful. Like most powerful tools, it can be used well or poorly, and the difference is almost entirely about context. The traditional societies that incorporated psychedelic plants into their practices, and there were many, understood this implicitly. The Amazonian communities that have been using ayahuasca for centuries did not hand it out as a casual recreational beverage. It was prepared with specific rituals, consumed in specific settings, administered by specific individuals trained over years to guide the experience, and followed by specific practices of integration. The indigenous Mexican traditions that used psilocybin mushrooms did so within ceremonial contexts, often at night, with chanting and prayer and community support. The peyote ceremonies of several North American tribes which continue today are carefully structured all-night vigils with specific songs, specific roles, and specific purposes. The chemistry was the same chemistry we're talking about tonight. The setting was not accidental. It had been refined over generations by peoples who understood, without needing to write it down in neuroscience journals, that a powerful reset requires a container capable of holding what gets opened. The sophistication of these containers is worth appreciating, because it tends to be underestimated in the modern conversation. A person preparing for an ayahuasca ceremony in a traditional Amazonian community does not simply show up and drink something. There are usually dietary restrictions for days or weeks before, including abstention from salt, sugar, alcohol, and certain foods thought to interact poorly with the medicine. There is guidance from someone experienced. There is a specific time of night chosen for the ceremony, a specific physical arrangement of participants, specific songs called icaros that are understood to shape the experience in particular ways, and specific responsibilities assumed by the facilitator. If the session becomes difficult for a participant, the facilitator knows what to do, because people have been doing this for a very long time. If something challenging or frightening comes up during the experience, there is a framework of interpretation ready to help the participant make sense of it. Afterwards, there are practices of integration, usually including conversation, more songs, and instruction about how to carry the insights of the night into ordinary life. The whole architecture is designed to make the journey safe enough, supported enough, and legible enough that the participant can actually use it. This kind of infrastructure is not a nice to have, it is a precondition of the practice. It is worth noting with some humility that the modern industrial West largely lacks such containers. This was not always the case. There is evidence that the ancient Mediterranean world had its own ceremonial traditions involving substances of this family, though the details are obscured by the passage of time and the deliberate destruction of the relevant institutions, as we'll see in coming chapters. But in the vacuum left by the loss of these practices, the contemporary cultural landscape has not quite figured out what to do with a category of experience that, biochemically, is perfectly available and, phenomenologically, can be among the most consequential experiences a human being ever has. The traditional cultures had a whole infrastructure for handling this. Initiation rites, elders trained in the work, communities that knew how to receive someone coming out of a pivotal experience and help them integrate it. Most of us do not. This is not a failure of character. It is a genuine gap in the cultural fabric, a gap that grew over centuries and is only now, haltingly, being acknowledged. There is a subtler point tucked into this history that deserves attention. The reason the emergency reset exists at all is that stability, useful as it is also dangerous. A nervous system that could never revise its fundamental assumptions would, in a changing world, eventually encounter conditions its assumptions could not handle. And it would then die holding its assumptions. Evolution does not care about assumptions. Evolution cares about survival. So it engineered a small, reliable mechanism by which even the most confident, well-established internal model can, under sufficient pressure, be pried open enough to admit new information. The mechanism does not fire casually. It is reserved for genuine stakes. But its existence reveals something important about how nervous systems work. At the deepest level, even the most stable self is provisional. Even the most confident set of beliefs is, in principle, revisable. The capacity for revision has not been fully locked down, because a fully locked down system would eventually lose the arms race with a changing world. The dial is always there. It is just usually quiet. This has philosophical implications that the traditions, long before neuroscience, intuited. Every contemplative lineage that takes consciousness seriously arrives, in its own idiom, at a version of the same claim. The self you usually take yourself to be is not the whole story. There is, underneath or alongside or prior to the familiar narrating self, something else, something less bounded, something less attached to the specific grooves the default network has worn into the cortex. The traditions disagree, sometimes vigorously, about how to describe this something else. They agree that direct encounter with it is possible, that such encounters tend to be transformative, and that the ordinary operations of the mind are, in effect, a veil over it rather than its substance. The neuroscience we have been assembling over these chapters does not and cannot prove any metaphysical claim about the ultimate nature of that something else. What it does show is that the veil, if we call it that, is made of specific neural activity, involving specific networks, tuned by specific receptors, and that the tuning can be adjusted. Whether what lies behind the adjusted tuning is a deeper reality, or simply a different brain state, is a question that remains open. Honest researchers in this field tend to hold the question open, which is the right thing to do, and also tends to disappoint both enthusiasts and skeptics in roughly equal measure. Where all of this leaves us, for the story we're telling tonight, is at an interesting threshold. We have now followed the thread from a glass of water in a Hollywood garden down to the physical receptor that was quietly responding to the molecule in that glass. We have seen why the receptor is there, what it normally does, and what it can do under unusual circumstances. We have seen that the emergency function has been known to human cultures, under various guises for many thousands of years, and that the traditional techniques for engaging it were almost always held within elaborate supportive frameworks. And we have seen that the direct chemical route, which bypasses the slow methods and delivers the activation with unusual intensity, has existed for much longer than most people realize, wrapped up in ceremonial traditions that in many cases predate recorded history. What remains to understand, in the coming stretches of the story, is what happened to those traditions, how some of them were lost, how others were hidden, how a handful were rediscovered in the 20th century under conditions almost designed to strip away the context that made them work, and how the consequences of that rediscovery, for good and for ill, are still shaping the conversation around consciousness, mental health, and the relationship between science and meaning right down to the present moment. Now we follow one of those lost traditions into the light, because its story is not merely a historical curiosity. It is, arguably, one of the most important missing pieces in the puzzle of how the modern West came to be so spectacularly good at building machines, and so curiously bad at knowing what to do with its own interior. The tradition in question unfolded on a rocky coast about 14 miles northwest of Athens, in a small town called Eleusis, and for roughly 2,000 years it drew, once a year, some of the most distinguished figures of the ancient Mediterranean world into an initiation ceremony so tightly guarded that describing it openly was, by law, punishable by death. The ceremony was called the Eleusinian Mysteries, and for nearly 20 centuries it was something close to the spiritual backbone of the Greek-speaking world. Then, over the course of a few brisk decades in late antiquity, it was shut down, the temple dismantled, the priesthood scattered, and the specific knowledge of what had actually happened during those nights quietly lost to history, which is, if you think about it, a remarkable thing to have happened to what had been, in its time, a cornerstone institution of an entire civilization. To understand the significance of the mysteries, it helps to start with the myth they were organized around. The story goes roughly like this. Demeter, the goddess of grain, earth, and the cycles of agriculture, had a daughter named Persephone. Persephone was, by all accounts, charming and beloved, and she spent her days in the kind of pastoral serenity ancient Mediterranean people associated with the presence of something divine. One day, while she was picking flowers in a meadow, the ground opened beneath her, and Hades, the lord of the underworld, rose up in his chariot and took her down into the land of the dead. Demeter, devastated by the loss, wandered the earth in mourning, refusing to let anything grow. The fields dried, the harvest failed. The human beings, dependent on the grain she had been teaching them to cultivate, began to starve. Eventually, after various negotiations involving the major gods of the pantheon, a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with Hades and part of each year above, with her mother. Her return, each spring, would bring the renewal of growth. Her descent, each autumn, would return the world to dormancy. Her story, in other words, was the mythological map of why plants die in the winter and come back in the spring, and why human beings who depended on those plants had to live their lives inside this recurring rhythm of loss and return. The myth, at the level of surface meaning, is already rich. But the mysteries went further. They took the myth and turned it into a ritual, enacted over a period of days, in which the initiates did not merely hear the story but in some sense lived it. They walked in procession from Athens to Eleusis, roughly a 14-mile trek along a road that, even today, preserves bits of the ancient route. They fasted, they bathed in the sea, they made offerings, and then, on the climactic night of the ceremony, inside a great covered hall called the Telesterion, which had been specifically designed for this purpose and could hold several thousand people, something happened. Something the initiates would describe for the rest of their lives in hushed and reverent tones. Something that the few surviving references in Greek literature refer to with an almost unanimous sense that it had changed them permanently. We know they saw things because they say so. We know they heard things because they say so. We know they felt, at some point during the night, that they had undergone a kind of death and been returned from it. But the specific content of what they experienced was, by agreement, never to be disclosed outside the hall, and across 2,000 years of participation, across hundreds of thousands of initiates from every stratum of Mediterranean society, the secret held. The design of the Telesterion itself is worth lingering on, because buildings, like any other cultural artifact, tend to reveal the priorities of the people who build them. Most Greek religious architecture of the classical period was organized around the exterior. Temples were designed to be admired from outside. The central image of the god typically lived in a relatively small inner room, which ordinary worshippers rarely entered. Ritual took place on the altar in front of the temple, under the open sky, visible to anyone who happened to be passing by. The Telesterion at Eleusis worked on the opposite principle. It was designed to be entered. It was designed to hold a large number of people for extended periods, at night, indoors. Its interior was structured as a vast hypostyle hall, with rows of columns and tiered seating along the walls, focused on a small central structure called the Anacteron, which was considered the most sacred point in the building, and which non-initiates were forbidden to approach. This was, in architectural terms, one of the rare ancient buildings designed from the ground up for something like collective interior experience. The Greeks of the classical period did not waste their building resources on ordinary assembly halls. When they built something this ambitious, this specifically shaped for a single purpose, the purpose was invariably something they considered fundamental. The fact that the Telesterion was repeatedly enlarged over centuries, with successive reconstructions expanding its capacity to accommodate ever more initiates, tells you something about how central the institution was to the communities that maintained it. The roster of known initiates tells you something about how seriously the ancient world took this. Plato was one, Aristotle was reportedly another. Sophocles, Pindar, and various other major Greek poets went through the ceremony. Roman emperors, from Augustus onward, travelled to Eleusis to be initiated. Cicero, the great Roman orator, wrote one of the most frequently quoted passages about the mysteries, in which he said that among all the glorious and divine things Athens had produced and shared with the wider world, nothing was better than these mysteries, by which human beings had been softened from a rough and savage way of life into the condition of humanity itself, and had learned not only how to live with joy, but how to die with a better hope. When Cicero says something that hyperbolic, it is usually because he's trying to sell you something. When Cicero says it about the mysteries, it seems rather that he was trying to point, as carefully as he was allowed to, at something he genuinely thought was the single most valuable cultural export of the Greek world. For the longest time, historians and classicists treated the question of what actually happened inside the Telesterion as essentially unanswerable. The Greeks kept their secret. The bits of surviving evidence from late antique commentators and from early Christian writers, who had sometimes obtained scraps of information through various indirect channels, were fragmentary and contradictory. There were references to a sacred drink called the kykeon, which initiates consumed during the ceremony. There were hints about visions. There were allusions to a performance of some kind, involving light, darkness, and the dramatic revelation of sacred objects. But nothing pieced together into a coherent picture, and most serious scholars, faced with the fragmentary record, simply shrugged and moved on to better documented topics. The mysteries were treated as one of those delicious ancient puzzles that would probably never be solved. Then, in the late 20th century, an unusual collaboration of scholars began to reopen the question from a very different angle. On one side was Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had, several decades earlier, accidentally synthesized a particular ergot-derived compound and accidentally discovered its unusual properties. On another side was R. Gordon Wasson, a banker-turned-amateur ethnomycologist who had spent years studying the ceremonial use of psychoactive mushrooms in various traditional cultures. On a third side was Carl A. P. Ruck, a classicist who was willing to entertain ideas that the more conservative wing of his field considered, let us say, unusual. Together, in the late 1970s, they published a short and provocative book arguing that the ancient Greek kykeon had most likely contained psychoactive compounds derived from ergot, a fungal parasite that grows on grains and contains, among other things, natural precursors to the family of molecules that later chemistry would synthesize in more refined forms. Their argument was that the specific kind of transformative experience the mysteries had reliably produced for 2,000 years across hundreds of thousands of initiates was most easily explained if the sacred drink had been a carefully prepared preparation of these compounds, administered in a setting engineered to make the experience meaningful. It was a bold hypothesis. For decades, it remained a bold hypothesis, debated in certain corners of classical scholarship, but never quite breaking into the mainstream, because the direct archaeological evidence was still lacking. What changed the conversation and brought the question back into active debate was a more recent book by the American scholar Brian Murarescu titled The Immortality Key, which appeared in 2020. Murarescu, who spent a dozen years combing through archives, visiting excavation sites, and interviewing archaeochemists working on analysing residues from ancient ceramic vessels, made a sustained case that the evidence for psychoactive substances in Greek ritual contexts was stronger than mainstream scholarship had been willing to acknowledge. He pointed to specific chemical analyses of ritual vessels that had turned up traces of precisely the kinds of compounds the earlier researchers had hypothesized. He drew on older classical references with a fresh eye, showing how certain passages that had been read metaphorically for generations made much more sense read literally. He framed his argument carefully, avoiding the fringe-adjacent tone that had sometimes accompanied earlier speculation on this topic, and in doing so pulled the conversation into a more respectable scholarly space than it had previously occupied. His conclusions remain contested, as they probably should be. The evidence is not yet definitive, but the case is now strong enough that it is genuinely difficult to dismiss, and the cumulative weight of the chemical, textual and archaeological threads points, more plausibly than not, in the same direction. The ancient Greeks, it seems, had figured out one of the traditional routes to the cortical reset we have been discussing, and they had wrapped it in one of the most sophisticated ritual containers any civilization has ever built. The Greek word for what the initiates experienced at the climax of the ceremony is worth sitting with, because it captures something that modern vocabulary struggles to articulate. The word is athanatizin, which means, very roughly, to be made immortal. But the Greek sense was more specific than the English word immortal usually suggests. It did not mean that after the ritual, the initiate would never physically die. Everyone understood perfectly well that the bodies of initiates, like everyone else's bodies, would eventually give out. What athanatizin meant was something more like this. The initiate had, during the night, undergone an experience of death before the literal death arrived, and had emerged from it knowing from the inside that what they ordinarily took to be themselves was not the whole story. They had tasted, in some fashion that remained theirs for the rest of their lives, a kind of being that was not extinguished by the end of the body. To put it in the slightly dry terms of the phrase associated with the tradition, they had learned how to die before dying, so that when they came to die, they would not, in the fullest sense, die. The specificity of that formulation is striking. It is not, notice, a claim about theological afterlife in the modern Christian or Islamic sense. The Greek world had various beliefs about what happened to souls after death, most of them fairly bleak in the older strata, with shades drifting through a dim underworld, and only the rarest figures receiving any kind of elevated condition. The mysteries did not primarily work by offering a better afterlife. They worked by offering a direct experience, in this life, of a dimension of being that survived the obvious facts of biographical death. Having had the experience, the initiate's relationship with their own mortality was transformed. The terror did not necessarily disappear, but something had been added that changed the texture of it. A knowledge that was not book knowledge, a recognition that was not theoretical. and the ancient world seems to have considered this the single most valuable piece of cultural inheritance the Greek tradition had on offer. A judgment that modern neuroscience, with its emerging data on how mystical experiences affect the fear of death in terminally ill patients, is beginning to find suggestive rather than absurd. For roughly 2,000 years, this institution operated on a more or less continuous basis. It survived the rise and fall of Athens. It survived the coming of the Macedonians, and of Alexander, and of the successor kingdoms. It survived the Roman conquest and in fact flourished under the Roman Empire, as Roman elites adopted Greek culture wholesale and incorporated the mysteries into their own spiritual vocabulary. It survived the early centuries of Christianity, during which the new religion grew up alongside the older traditions, with relatively little direct conflict for quite a while. For the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, most Mediterraneans simply had access to a spiritual landscape that included both the old mystery traditions and the new Christian communities, and educated people were often involved in both. The mysteries even survived the conversion of Constantine in the early 4th century, which tipped imperial patronage toward Christianity, but did not immediately eliminate the older institutions. Eleusis kept running. The priests of the old line kept training their successors. The initiations continued. The secret, astonishingly, held. Then, fairly suddenly, the situation changed. As the 4th century progressed, and as Christianity transformed from a persecuted minority into the official religion of the empire, the older traditions began to come under increasing pressure. The logic of an imperial religion is not the same as the logic of a minority faith. Once Christianity had the machinery of the state behind it, certain of its theological commitments began to have legislative consequences. Pagan temples were converted, closed, or destroyed across the Mediterranean. Priesthoods that had been supported by imperial patronage found their funding cut. Public rituals that had been part of civic life for centuries were discouraged and then banned. The details varied from region to region and from emperor to emperor. The general trajectory was clear. The old pluralistic spiritual landscape, in which many traditions had coexisted with varying degrees of friendliness, was being consolidated into something tighter, more centralized, and less tolerant of practices that could not be fit into the new orthodoxy. The specific blow that ended Eleusis came in the year 364, under the Emperor Valentinian I, who issued a decree banning all nocturnal rituals throughout the empire. The ostensible reason was concern about morality. Night rituals were associated in the imperial imagination with the kinds of activities emperors tended to find inconvenient: secret gatherings, unsupervised communities, practices that took place outside the daylight scrutiny of official religious authorities. By prohibiting nocturnal ceremonies, the decree effectively targeted a whole swath of traditional practices whose distinctive feature was that they happened in the dark, with small groups under conditions of ritual seclusion. The mysteries, which took place at night inside a sealed hall, fell squarely within the scope of the ban. Unless an exception could be obtained, the institution was finished. It is worth pausing to consider why nocturnal rituals specifically became such a target. Daylight ritual was public, visible, and relatively easy to monitor. It could be absorbed into the new imperial orthodoxy or simply closed down without much fuss. Nocturnal ritual was fundamentally different. It took place in enclosed spaces, at reduced energy, often after long preparation, in states of altered awareness, produced by the combination of fasting, sleep restriction, darkness, and in some cases the specific substances we have been discussing. The kinds of experiences reliably produced by such settings are, as we have seen in earlier sections, among the most powerful tools any culture has for reshaping its members. The political authorities of late antiquity did not have the neuroscientific vocabulary to describe what was happening inside those halls, but they understood, at a more practical level, that something was being transmitted there that they did not fully control. An institution that could reliably transform the consciousness of its participants in ways that modern research is only now beginning to map was, from the perspective of a consolidating imperial religion, a problem. It was a source of spiritual authority that ran parallel to the official channels, and such sources, in periods of theological consolidation, tend to find themselves under pressure regardless of what specific content they happen to be transmitting. An exception was requested. The story of how it was requested and by whom is one of those small, vivid details that brings an entire lost world briefly back into view. The Roman prefect of the East at the time was a man named Vettius Agorius Praetextatus, one of the last great pagan statesmen of the Western Empire, and a figure of considerable stature, even among his Christian contemporaries. He was personally initiated in multiple mystery traditions, including the Eleusinian, and he was, by all accounts, deeply attached to the spiritual landscape the new decrees were in the process of dismantling. Praetextatus went directly to the emperor to plead for an exception specifically for Eleusis. His argument was simple and, given the context, remarkably direct. Without these rites, he said, life itself would become unlivable. He did not phrase this as a mere sentimental preference. He used a word in Greek, abiotos, which is the negation of the root meaning life. It translates roughly as not life, or unlivable, or life that could not really be called life. What he was saying, in effect, was that the mysteries were not a nice to have. They were, in his view, constitutive of a human existence worth living. Remove them, and what remains is still biologically alive, but something essential has gone out of it. Valentinian, for his own reasons, did grant the exception. Eleusis survived the decree of 364, but the reprieve was temporary. Over the subsequent decades, under successive emperors and against a rising tide of Christianization, the old institutions steadily lost ground. The mysteries were finally ended in the late 4th century, when the sanctuary at Eleusis was destroyed during one of the waves of violence that periodically swept across the late Roman world. The exact circumstances are disputed. Some sources attribute the destruction to Gothic raiders passing through the area. Others suggest Christian mobs were the primary agents. The result in any case was the same. The temple was reduced to rubble. The priestly line, which had been kept within a small number of specific families for many generations, was broken. The knowledge of how the ceremony had actually worked, the specific preparation of the kykion, the choreography of the ritual, the structure of the nocturnal revelation was, to the extent it had ever been written down at all, deliberately suppressed or simply lost as the last initiates died. 2,000 years of continuous transmission ended, functionally, within the span of a single generation. An institution that had been older than most of what we now consider classical philosophy was, within a handful of decades, reduced to a set of cryptic references in surviving texts and a pile of stones you can visit today on the edge of a small Greek town. Murarescu makes a striking observation about the long-term consequences of this loss, one that is worth considering carefully, even if we want to remain cautious about the specifics. When Eleusis closed, and when the various related mystery traditions around the Mediterranean were suppressed over the same general period, the civilization that eventually became the modern West lost something that no other major civilization had lost quite so thoroughly. It lost its ritual container for the deliberate, culturally sanctioned opening of the kind of emergency valve we have been describing. Other civilizations kept theirs. The Hindu traditions retained their tantric practices. The Chinese traditions kept their Taoist inner alchemy. The various indigenous traditions of the Americas, Africa, and Australia kept their plant medicines and their shamanic disciplines. Tibetan Buddhism preserved an astonishingly sophisticated set of contemplative techniques aimed at deliberately producing and integrating pivotal mental states. The Sufi orders within Islam preserved practices of ecstatic prayer. The Hasidic movements within Judaism, though much later, developed their own charged contemplative traditions. The modern West, alone among the major civilizational streams, consolidated a culture in which the institutional route to these experiences had been closed off, and in which the mainstream religious institutions that remained were increasingly oriented around doctrinal belief, moral behavior, and symbolic participation rather than around direct experiential contact with the kind of states the older mystery traditions had cultivated. This is not to say that mystical experience vanished entirely from the Christian West. It did not. The great Christian mystics of the medieval and early modern periods, from Meister Eckhart to Teresa of Avila to John of the Cross, were obviously describing states that overlapped substantially with what the older traditions had been after. Various heterodox movements throughout the centuries, from the Quakers to the Shakers to certain strands of Pentecostalism, have always kept the experiential dimension alive at the margins of the broader religious culture. But these remained, for the most part, exceptional. They were the work of particular individuals, or of small communities, rather than an institutional infrastructure that the mainstream could draw on as a matter of course. An ordinary educated person in the late Roman world, or in most of the pre-modern world for that matter, would have assumed that direct encounter with the divine was, at minimum, a recognized category of experience that a society ought to have some organized way of supporting. An ordinary educated person in the modern West typically does not. Such experiences are, in the default cultural frame, either the province of unusually devout religious specialists, or of people whose reports should be listened to with polite concern, or of drug users whose testimony should be discounted. There is no mainstream institutional context in most Western societies for the direct, deliberate, carefully supported cultivation of the kind of pivotal state the Greeks had built an entire annual cycle around. The philosopher René Descartes, writing in the 17th century and laying down what would become the operating assumptions of modern Western thought, articulated with unusual clarity the worldview that eventually emerged from the long process of closure begun in late antiquity. Descartes divided reality into two fundamentally separate domains. There was the physical world, the realm of extended matter, governed by mechanical laws, measurable, predictable, and in principle fully knowable through systematic observation. And there was the mental world, the realm of thought, consciousness, and subjectivity, connected to the physical world only by a thin and somewhat mysterious thread. The two domains in his framework did not really mix. The scientist studied the physical. The theologian, perhaps, had something to say about the mental. Neither domain admitted the kind of direct participatory knowing that the older mystery traditions had cultivated, in which the observer and the observed were understood to share a common substance, and in which a particular kind of altered state could bring that shared substance into direct experience. The Cartesian split, as it came to be called, was enormously productive. It allowed the natural sciences to develop with a freedom from metaphysical entanglement that would have been impossible under the older frameworks. Most of what we now consider modern science would not have been possible without it. But it also came at a cost that Descartes himself probably did not fully appreciate. It sealed off, at the level of basic intellectual assumption, the territory the mystery traditions had spent centuries mapping, and it did so thoroughly that by the time the modern psychedelic compounds were synthesized in the 20th century, the culture that received them had, by and large, lost the conceptual vocabulary to understand what they were. The split was not, to be fair to Descartes, entirely his invention. He codified tendencies that had been building for centuries in Western thought, going back through medieval scholasticism and ultimately, in part, to choices made by certain late antique thinkers in the same centuries when the mysteries were being closed down. What Descartes did was give these tendencies a clean philosophical formulation that could serve as the working assumption of a rising scientific culture. Once the formulation was in place, the question of what to do with experiences that did not fit into either the purely physical or the purely mental domains became structurally difficult. If such experiences were physical, they had to be reducible to ordinary brain events, which, on a naive reading, meant they could not be telling us anything beyond the brain itself. If they were mental, they belonged to the separate domain that science was, by design, not especially equipped to study. Either way, the kind of experiences the mystery traditions had cultivated fell through the cracks of the new intellectual architecture. They became, at best, interesting anomalies. At worst, they were dismissed entirely, and the specific kind of direct experiential knowing the initiates had received at Eleusis had no natural home in a worldview that had been built, in part, by closing off exactly that kind of knowing. This is worth stressing because it explains something that would otherwise be puzzling. When the compounds returned, first in the laboratory and then in broader cultural circulation, the Western scientific establishment did not, for the most part, have a framework for taking the experiences seriously. The experiences were classified as hallucinations in the dismissive sense, as signs of psychiatric disturbance, or as curiosities that might have limited therapeutic application but that certainly could not be teaching anyone anything about the actual structure of reality. The traditional cultures that had kept their mystery traditions intact, when they encountered the synthesized compounds, tended to recognize what was happening as a variant of things their own traditions had been engaging with for centuries. They had vocabulary, they had context, they had elders who knew how to guide the experiences. The modern West, having spent several centuries carefully dismantling such resources, had none of these things when they were most needed. We will see, in the stretch ahead, what happened when the compounds arrived in a culture unprepared to receive them, and why the ensuing collision was one of the more consequential cultural events of the 20th century, still reverberating through the present moment in ways we have not yet fully absorbed. There is one more detail about Eleusis worth saving for last, because it casts a certain kind of melancholy light on the whole situation. The physical site still exists. You can today visit what is left of the telesterion in modern Eleusis, which is mostly foundations, scattered column drums, and the outlines of the old ritual path. The town itself has become, over the centuries, a modest industrial suburb of Athens, complete with shipyards and cement factories. The spot where, for 2,000 years, tens of thousands of human beings came seeking the single most important experience their civilization had to offer, is now, by most descriptions, a slightly melancholy patch of ruins sandwiched between more recent industrial development. This is not said to criticize the modern Greeks, who have preserved what they could, and who, to their credit, maintain a small museum on the site. It is said because the physical arrangement captures something the written account cannot quite express. A civilization once built an institution here that, in the judgment of many of its most thoughtful members, gave human life itself a quality it could not have without. The institution is gone. The knowledge of how it worked is gone. The stones remain. The question of whether the modern world can or should try to rebuild something that performs a similar function, with appropriate adjustments for contemporary circumstances, is one of the quiet subtexts of everything the current psychedelic renaissance is trying to work out. And it is not a question with an easy answer, because what was lost at Eleusis was not just a set of techniques, it was the entire ecology of meaning that made the techniques consequential. Rebuilding the techniques is the easier part. Rebuilding the ecology, if it can be done at all, is the work of generations. 16 centuries pass, roughly. A long span in which the West builds cathedrals, invents the printing press, argues about religion, invents the scientific method, builds empires, loses them, invents photography, invents flight, invents radio, and eventually, sometime in the middle of the 20th century, quite accidentally rediscovers the chemistry the old traditions had been using all along. The rediscovery happens not in a temple or a grove, but in a tidy Swiss laboratory, on an afternoon so ordinary that the man at the bench is thinking mostly about the paperwork he'll have to do after lunch. His name is Albert Hoffmann. He's a mid-career chemist at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel, and he has no idea he's about to become one of the most quietly consequential figures of his century. Hoffmann had been working, in the late 1930s, on a project that was, by the standards of industrial pharmaceutical research, thoroughly unglamorous. His team was investigating compounds derived from ergot, the same fungus that had played a starring role in the medieval peasants' list of unpleasant ways to die. Ergot contamination of rye, which gave rise to the condition known as ergotism or St. Anthony's fire, had caused waves of bizarre mass poisonings across Europe for centuries. Unfortunately for the peasants, ergot alkaloids, taken in large uncontrolled doses, produced gangrene, seizures, psychosis, and often death. Fortunately for modern medicine, certain of those same alkaloids, prepared carefully at much smaller doses, had useful properties. They could stop postpartum bleeding, they could treat migraines, they could do various other things that pharmaceutical companies wanted to bottle and sell. Sandoz had given Hoffmann the task of systematically synthesizing variations on the ergot structure, looking for new compounds with useful therapeutic profiles. It was painstaking work. Most of the molecules he made turned out to be unremarkable. They were tested on animals, shelved and forgotten. In 1938, Hoffmann made the 25th compound in a particular subseries, which meant that, by the cheerfully unromantic logic of industrial chemistry, it was filed as LSD-25. The letters stood for the German version of lysergic acid diethylamide. The number was just its place in line. The compound was tested, showed no particularly notable pharmacological effects in the animal models of the time, and was duly shelved along with all the others. That should have been the end of its story. For 5 years it was. Hoffmann moved on to other projects. The Second World War broke out and consumed the attention of most of Europe. Sandoz kept running its research programs, as Swiss companies somehow continued to do through the war, and LSD-25 sat in storage, unremarked upon, one compound among thousands. Then, in the spring of 1943, Hoffmann decided, on what he later described as a peculiar hunch, to revisit the compound. There was nothing rational about the decision. Compounds that had been shelved for failing their initial screening were, by the normal procedures of the lab, simply not reworked. Hoffman could not quite articulate why he wanted to synthesize LSD-25 again. He just had a feeling that the molecule deserved another look. He later wrote, looking back, that a scientist who listens to such hunches is occasionally rewarded for doing so, and that this particular hunch would turn out to be the most consequential one of his professional life. On April 16th of that year, he was in the process of preparing a fresh batch of the compound when, toward the end of the afternoon, he began to feel, as he put it, notably unusual. A kind of pleasant restlessness had come over him. Colours seemed more vivid. His thoughts were flowing in ways that felt unfamiliar. He eventually concluded he had to stop working, and he went home to lie down in a darkened room, where, over the next couple of hours, he experienced what he described as a remarkable stream of fantastic images, extraordinarily vivid, accompanied by an intense play of colours. After a few hours, the effect faded. Hoffman was left puzzled. He had, he believed, somehow absorbed a tiny amount of the compound through his skin, perhaps while transferring it between containers, and he suspected, correctly, that he had stumbled onto something whose properties had no precedent in the pharmaceutical literature of his time. 3 days later, on the afternoon of April 19, 1943, he decided to test the hypothesis in the only way that mattered. He deliberately dosed himself. Being a careful scientist and being worried about taking too much, he gave himself what he considered a conservative amount, 250 micrograms, which he recorded precisely in his laboratory notebook. He did not yet understand that this compound was so staggeringly potent that 250 micrograms was, by the standards of every other pharmaceutical substance known at the time, absurdly high. A typical active dose of most psychoactive drugs was in the milligram range, roughly 1,000 times larger. Hoffman had, in effect, dosed himself to the eyeballs without realizing it. He recorded the time, drank his carefully measured solution, and sat down to observe. Within 20 minutes he was beginning to have what was, objectively, a somewhat difficult time of it. The usual precautions of his well-ordered Swiss laboratory were dissolving around him. He called to his assistant and requested, with what he later described as the greatest restraint, that they leave for home, since the wartime gasoline rationing meant the bicycle was the available mode of transportation. And so, on what would come to be known in certain circles as Bicycle Day, one of the most significant chemical events of the 20th century involved a middle-aged Swiss chemist pedaling through the streets of wartime Basel while experiencing, at a dose approximately 5 times higher than any modern clinical study would consider responsible, the full effects of LSD. His assistant, who had accompanied him on foot, later recalled that Hoffman seemed to be making perfectly ordinary progress on the bicycle, although Hoffman himself reported from the inside that he felt he was pedaling at enormous speed through a strange and dreamlike city whose familiar streets had taken on a quality of almost hallucinatory vividness. Buildings seemed to lean in, colours pulsed, time moved, at various points in the ride, extremely slowly. They made it home without incident. Hoffman spent several alarming hours during which he was fairly certain he had poisoned himself fatally, before the experience shifted in the later part of the evening into something he would describe for the rest of his long life as among the most profoundly meaningful he had ever had. He lay in bed, watching the play of images, and came to the slow realization that he had opened a door whose existence the pharmaceutical industry had not known to look for. There is a detail from that night worth including, because it captures something about Hoffman himself that helps explain why he became such a thoughtful elder of the field over the following decades. At the peak of the frightening phase, when he believed his heart might be giving out, a neighbour arrived with a glass of milk which had been summoned as a rough antidote. In his altered state, Hoffman perceived the neighbour not as a kindly middle-aged woman from down the street, but as a malevolent witch in a colourful mask. He later wrote about this with considerable good humour, noting that his neighbour had, in reality, done nothing to deserve the role his mind had cast her in. The fact that he could laugh about it afterward, rather than letting the difficult phase of the experience define his relationship to the compound, says something about his temperament. Hoffman lived to be 102, remained professionally active well into his 90s, and spent much of the latter half of his life cautiously urging the medical and scientific communities to take seriously what he had accidentally discovered. He was never, at any point in his very long life, a proponent of casual recreational use. He was essentially a Swiss pharmaceutical chemist who believed the molecule he had made deserved the kind of careful, respectful attention the culture had mostly failed to give it. Sandoz, over the following years, began quietly distributing LSD to psychiatrists and researchers around the world under the trade name Delicid. The idea, initially, was not that LSD was a medicine for any specific condition. It was marketed rather as a research tool. Psychiatrists, it was suggested, could take small doses themselves to get a first-hand sense of what psychotic experiences might be like, which was supposed to make them more empathetic clinicians. The compound might also, the promotional material suggested, be useful in exploring the nature of mental illness, since its effects seem to overlap in interesting ways with certain symptoms. Throughout the late 1940s and the 1950s, a steady stream of research papers appeared in mainstream medical journals, exploring what LSD did, how it might be used therapeutically, and what it might reveal about the workings of the mind. Thousands of patients and volunteers were dosed in clinical settings across Europe and North America during this period, usually at doses significantly lower than Hoffman's accidental first outing. The results were, by the reports of the time, surprisingly promising. Studies suggested that the compound could help certain forms of anxiety, could be useful in the treatment of alcoholism, and could catalyze therapeutic breakthroughs in patients who had been stuck for years in conventional psychoanalysis. The tone of the research literature during this period is striking in retrospect. It treats LSD as a genuinely interesting new clinical tool, not as the cultural menace it would later become. Meanwhile, a parallel thread of the story was unfolding in a very different part of the world. In a small town in the Sierra Mazateca mountains of southern Mexico, an indigenous Mazatec healer named Maria Sabina was practicing a tradition of ceremonial healing that involved the careful use of certain psilocybin-containing mushrooms. The tradition was old. How old exactly, no one knows. The mushrooms had been used in Mesoamerican religious contexts for centuries before the arrival of the Spanish, and after the conquest had gone mostly underground, preserved by a handful of families in remote communities who continued the practice in quiet defiance of the Church's ongoing disapproval. By the early 1950s, Maria Sabina was regarded locally as a particularly gifted practitioner, someone whose night-long ceremonies produced results that kept her small community's population of sickly relatives relatively well served. Into this situation, in the spring of 1955, walked R. Gordon Wasson, an American banker who had, through a combination of family interest and personal obsession, become one of the world's foremost amateur students of the cultural uses of mushrooms. Wasson had spent years researching the traditional uses of psychoactive fungi across various cultures. He had read everything there was to read on the topic. He had followed up every lead he could find, and by the mid-1950s, after extensive correspondence with an anthropologist who had worked in the region, he had located Maria Sabina's community and had, with persistence and with considerable diplomatic effort, convinced her to allow him to participate in a ceremony. On the night of June 29, 1955, Wasson and his companion, a photographer named Alan Richardson, became, as far as the historical record knows, the first Westerners to participate as invited guests in an authentic Mazatec mushroom ceremony. The experience for Wasson was transformative. He was, by his own later accounts, not a religious man in any conventional sense, but what he underwent during that ceremony convinced him that he had participated in something ancient, consequential, and insufficiently known to the wider world. 2 years later, in May of 1957, Wasson published an essay in Life magazine describing the experience in detail. The essay was titled, with an editorial instinct for drama that Wasson himself had mixed feelings about, Seeking the Magic Mushroom. It ran as a major feature in what was then one of the most widely circulated magazines on Earth, reaching tens of millions of American households. The piece included Richardson's photographs of the ceremony, of Maria Sabina, and of the mushrooms themselves. For a substantial portion of the American reading public, this was the first time they had ever encountered the idea that there were substances growing in the world that could reliably produce transformative spiritual experiences, and that traditional communities had been using them ceremonially for centuries. The response was immediate, and mostly not the kind Wasson had hoped for. Thousands of Americans over the following years set out for the Mazatec highlands looking for the mushrooms. Many of them found Maria Sabina, who gradually watched her village become a pilgrimage site for a stream of outsiders whose interest in the ceremonies was often less serious than she might have wished. The cost to her community, and to her personally, was considerable. Toward the end of her life, she expressed regret about what her openness to Wasson had set in motion. Something old and carefully guarded had been unlocked, and what came through the unlocked door was not always what had been hoped for. Meanwhile, in the American academic world, the research current was picking up velocity in a way that would eventually have enormous cultural consequences. In 1960, two psychologists at Harvard University, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, began what they called the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Leary was a charismatic, ambitious, and deeply restless clinical psychologist who had recently had his own first experience with psilocybin in Mexico, and had come back convinced that he was holding in his hands the most important psychological tool since the invention of talk therapy. Alpert, who would later reinvent himself under the name Ram Dass, was a quieter but equally committed collaborator. Together they set up a research program at Harvard in which they administered psilocybin, obtained through legitimate channels from Sandoz, to various subjects in various settings. They dosed graduate students, they dosed artists, they dosed writers, including, in one much-discussed session, the novelist Arthur Koestler. They ran a famous study involving prisoners, aimed at exploring whether psilocybin could reduce recidivism. They ran another, involving divinity students, which came to be known as the Good Friday Experiment, aimed at exploring whether the compound could reliably produce mystical experiences under religious conditions. For a couple of years, this work proceeded within, or at least near, the bounds of conventional academic research. The results, depending on which subject you asked, range from life-changing breakthroughs to mildly interesting to frankly disappointing. The published findings were, on the whole, cautiously encouraging. But the trajectory of the project itself began to drift. Leary, in particular, was not really cut out to be a careful experimentalist. He was cut out to be a preacher, though he had not yet fully realized this about himself. He became increasingly convinced that the compound was too important to be kept within the narrow walls of academic psychology. He began hosting sessions at his home at a certain academic removed from the formal structures of Harvard's research ethics. He began dosing undergraduates, which was not, by the standards of the time or any other time, within the bounds of what research psychologists are supposed to do with their access to experimental compounds. His colleagues began, quietly at first and then more loudly, to express concerns. By 1963, Harvard had seen enough. Both Leary and Alpert were dismissed from their positions. They took the dismissal, as one might predict given their temperaments by this point, as a confirmation that the official institutions of American academic life were inadequate to the revolution they believed was coming. What followed was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable cultural wave. Leary and Alpert relocated to a large estate in upstate New York, provided to them by a wealthy sympathizer, where they began running what they called psychedelic research, under conditions that had little to do with conventional research, and much to do with what would later be called intentional community living. Meanwhile, Hoffman's original compound, along with its newer cousin psilocybin, was spreading through the American counterculture with the speed of something that did not need marketing. Students, musicians, artists, and writers were all getting their hands on the materials. A generation of young Americans, raised in the relative prosperity of the post-war years and already restless with the conformist culture their parents had built, was finding in these compounds a specific kind of experience that made their ordinary lives look strange. Things that had seemed important began to look less important. The imagined rewards of climbing the middle-class ladder began to look, under certain conditions, frankly absurd. And the idea that an entire civilization might be fundamentally misaligned with what actually mattered began to seem, to a growing number of young people, not paranoid, but plain. By the middle of the 1960s, estimates suggest that roughly 2 million Americans had tried LSD. The compound had moved from academic laboratories to the streets in an astonishingly short time, and the infrastructure for its cultural absorption was improvised at best. It showed up at rock concerts. It showed up at college parties. It showed up in situations that had none of the careful containing context the older traditions would have insisted on. The results, as one would expect from the perspective we have been building, were extremely uneven. Many people had experiences they would describe for the rest of their lives as among the most meaningful of their lives. Many others had experiences that range from mildly unsettling to deeply destabilizing. A small but significant minority was seriously harmed. The hospital systems of major American cities began seeing patients presenting with acute psychotic episodes associated with the compound. Some of these cases were genuine. Others were later reinterpreted as people in the middle of difficult but ultimately manageable experiences who had been placed in the least helpful possible environment for them, namely an emergency room full of bright lights, strangers in white coats, and anxious questions. The cultural conversation, which had been polite and academic only a few years before, became loud and alarmed. Somewhere in this period, the word psychedelic itself entered common usage. The word had actually been coined a few years earlier, in a letter between Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley in 1956. Osmond, who had already administered the original mescaline dose we met in the opening scene of this story, was looking for a word to describe the class of experiences these compounds produced. He wanted something that would capture the specific quality of mind revealing without being loaded with the clinical baggage of terms like psychotomimetic, which meant roughly imitating psychosis, and which made the experiences sound like mental illness by definition. Huxley, being Huxley, had a suggestion involving the Greek word for soul, which Osmond found too beautiful and too loaded. Osmond came back with a counter-suggestion built from slightly different Greek roots, meaning something like mind manifesting. Huxley thought the new coinage was slightly awkward in English, but accepted it. Psychedelic as a word was born in that correspondence. And by the mid-1960s it had escaped the careful bounds of the letter exchange and become a catch-all term for a specific subculture, a specific aesthetic, and a specific set of political attitudes. This brings us to a piece of the neuroscience that is worth dropping into the story now, because it explains, in a remarkably precise way, what was actually happening to all these minds at the cortical level, and why the cultural response to it took the shape it did. Carhart Harris, whose entropic brainwork we have been tracking, developed a more specific theoretical framework a few years later, which he and his colleagues called REBUS, which stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. The framework is technical in its full form, but its central insight is accessible. Recall that the brain, on the predictive processing view we explored earlier, is constantly generating top-down predictions about what the incoming sensory data should look like, and that ordinary perception is a tightly controlled negotiation between these predictions and the actual signal. Recall also that the strength with which the brain holds on to its top-down predictions can be tuned. Under ordinary conditions, it is tuned fairly tight. The predictions are confident. Evidence that contradicts them has to be quite strong to get them revised. This is useful for the reasons we discussed. It is also, as we saw, what produces the grooves into which a mind can sometimes get stuck. What psychedelics do, in the Rebus framework, is specifically and measurably reduce the confidence with which the brain holds its top-down predictions. The hierarchy of belief, which under ordinary conditions operates with the authority of an experienced judge, becomes, under these compounds, much more provisional. Signals from below, the raw sensory input and the spontaneous activity of lower levels of the cortical processing stream, are no longer filtered as aggressively. New interpretations become possible, old certainties lose their grip, connections that the normal machinery would have suppressed bubble up and demand attention. In a phrase Leary liked to use, though he meant it more politically than neuroscientifically, the state turns from a wise king into an anarchy. The top-down authority that ordinarily organizes the mind's experience loosens its hold, and for a few hours the brain operates in a much more democratic mode, with many more possible configurations on the table at any given moment. This framework, notice, explains both the therapeutic promise and the cultural disruption. Temporary loosening of rigid top-down beliefs is exactly the kind of intervention a brain stuck in the grooves of depression, obsession, or addiction might benefit from. It is also, at the social level, exactly the kind of experience likely to produce people who come out of it with very different views about whatever rigid top-down beliefs their society was trying to inculcate in them. You cannot, in general, reliably loosen the top-down predictions of 2 million mostly young minds over a handful of years and expect the resulting culture to look exactly like the one you started with, particularly if the loosening is happening without the kinds of supportive containers the traditional cultures had spent generations developing. The effects are going to be broad, uneven, and from the perspective of the established order, deeply alarming. Which is exactly what happened. Leary by this point had stopped pretending to be a scientist at all. he had become something more like a travelling evangelist, and his sermons were quotable. The famous formulation, turn on, tune in, drop out, which he delivered at a gathering in San Francisco in 1967, became one of the most influential and, in retrospect, most unhelpful slogans of the era. It was meant to be an invitation to conscious engagement with one's own experience, followed by deliberate withdrawal from what Leary considered the destructive pressures of mainstream American life. It was heard, by a large portion of its target audience, as a simpler message, which was roughly, take drugs and stop going to class. The slogan joined a joke Leary had been making for a while, that LSD could be read as an acronym for Let the State Dissolve. It was meant as wordplay. It was not received by the relevant authorities as wordplay. The federal government, the various state governments, and the parents of approximately one entire generation of American college students had reached by this point a consensus that something had to be done. What was done, over the span of about 2 years in the mid to late 1960s, was dramatic and comprehensive. A series of Senate hearings in 1966 gave the political culture its first sustained look at what the compound was doing to the country, and the view from those hearings was uniformly unfavourable. Parents testified about their children. Psychiatrists testified about the patients they were seeing. Television coverage, then at the peak of its cultural influence, framed the story almost entirely around the most alarming cases. The Food and Drug Administration, which had been overseeing the legal research use of these compounds, suspended new research protocols. The drug enforcement apparatus was consolidated and expanded. In 1968, LSD was formally placed into the most restrictive category of the federal drug schedule, which classified it as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Research, for all practical purposes, ended. The carefully accumulated clinical findings of the previous decade were essentially shelved. The compounds themselves went underground. An entire field of inquiry was, by an act of legislation, made into a career-ending thing for anyone who wanted to study it seriously. Sandoz, facing the reputational storm, withdrew its products from legitimate distribution. What is worth understanding in the light of the story we have been building is that this shutdown was not simply the closing of a drug loophole. It was the second closure of the same cultural door. The first closure, 1600 years earlier, had ended the mysteries and the related traditions we discussed. The second, in the late 1960s, ended the first modern attempt to rebuild an equivalent. The compounds were the same compounds, biochemically speaking, that had been used in the old ceremonial contexts. The experiences they produced were recognizably the same experiences by any reasonable criterion of comparison. What was missing, in both the 1960s American version and the late antique Mediterranean version, was the supportive infrastructure. The first closure had been motivated largely by theological consolidation. The second was motivated largely by the failure of a rapidly secularizing culture to absorb what it had, without knowing it, uncorked. In both cases, the result was the same. The door was shut, the key was thrown away, and the culture moved on with a vague sense that something potentially important had been set aside, but without any clear picture of what. For the next 40 years, psychedelic research in the Western academic mainstream was essentially dormant. A handful of scientists kept alive the flame in small ways, often at personal and professional cost. A handful of underground practitioners continued to work with the compounds in quiet, careful settings, often doing genuinely good work that the culture at large had no idea was happening. A handful of religious groups maintained legal exemptions to use certain plant medicines in ceremonial contexts, through various hard-fought court cases that are interesting in their own right but beyond our scope tonight. But the broad cultural project, the project of trying to figure out what to do with a category of experience that was, as we have seen, woven into the human nervous system from the start, was effectively on hold. It would be quite a while before the door began, cautiously, to open again, and when it did, it would open in a very different cultural setting, with very different vocabularies and with lessons, hard-won, from the collapse of the first modern attempt to guide it. 40 years is a long time in a culture. Children born in the year LSD went into the most restrictive category of the federal schedule, grew up, got educated, got jobs, had children of their own, and started approaching middle age. Whole professional careers began and ended in the shadow of that legislative decision. The research infrastructure that had been built through the 1950s and early 1960s was dismantled. its lead investigators either scattered to unrelated fields or in some cases ostracized entirely. A generation of graduate students received their training in a neuroscience where the question of how these compounds worked was, for all practical purposes, not a question you could ask without endangering your academic prospects. And yet, in the background, at the edges, in small laboratories and in quiet conversations at conferences, and in the private studies of certain unfashionable thinkers, the question did not entirely die. It got shelved. It did not disappear. And when the thaw finally came, in the first years of the new century, the people ready to pick it back up were waiting. The thaw came, as these things sometimes do, through a specific institution willing to take a specific careful risk. That institution was Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in Baltimore, and the specific risk-taker was a senior psychopharmacologist named Roland Griffiths. Griffiths was, by any reasonable description, the opposite of the stereotype most people carry around about psychedelic researchers. He was soft-spoken, conservative in his professional demeanour, a man who had spent decades doing mainstream work on caffeine and sleep. He had published hundreds of papers in respectable journals. He had served on federal advisory panels. He was, in the jargon of academic life, deeply credentialed. He was also, in a quieter part of his life, a serious meditator who had been practicing daily for years and who had come to the view that there were dimensions of consciousness worth studying that his ordinary scientific training was not well positioned to address. In the late 1990s, he began, quite carefully, to explore whether it might be possible to reopen the question of these compounds within a contemporary academic setting, with all the methodological rigour that had not been possible during the more chaotic first wave. He assembled a small team. He wrote proposals. He navigated the complex regulatory requirements for working with scheduled compounds. And in 2006, on the 100th anniversary of Hoffman's birth, he and his colleagues published a paper that would, quietly but decisively, change the scientific conversation. Getting that study off the ground required a sort of institutional stealth that is hard to appreciate unless you have tried to do something similar inside a large American research hospital. Working with a federally controlled substance in the most restrictive category means that every single procedure has to be cleared with multiple regulatory bodies. The drug itself has to be obtained through specific authorized channels, the storage has to meet rigorous security standards, and the research protocol has to pass ethics reviews of a thoroughness that would make most scientists reach for a calmer line of work. Griffiths handled all of this with the patience of a man who had decided correctly that the only way to restore legitimacy to this field was to exceed, rather than merely meet, every standard the conventional research environment could impose. He would not be accused later of cutting corners. The results he would eventually report would stand on a foundation so carefully laid that even skeptical reviewers would have difficulty dismissing them on methodological grounds. This was not incidental to the impact of the work. It was, in many ways, the reason the work was able to have impact at all. The paper reported on a study in which healthy adult volunteers, with no previous experience with these compounds, were given a single substantial dose of psilocybin in a carefully prepared setting. The preparation had been elaborate. Participants met multiple times with their session guides to build rapport. They were given thorough explanations of what the experience might involve. The session itself took place in a comfortable room designed to feel more like a quiet living space than a hospital, with eye shades, headphones playing a carefully curated musical program, and the presence of 2 trained facilitators throughout. After the session, participants completed a number of standardized questionnaires, including one that had been developed decades earlier to measure what psychologists, for lack of a better term, call mystical experience. The questionnaire, which had been refined over the years by researchers working in the psychology of religion, measured specific features: a sense of unity with something larger, a quality of sacredness, a perception of having encountered something ultimately real, a dropping away of ordinary time and space, an ineffability that made the experience difficult to put into words. The results were striking. Roughly 2/3 of the participants reported experiences that met the criteria for what the questionnaire called a complete mystical experience. This was not a percentage that had shown up in any other laboratory setting, with any other intervention, ever. Ordinary life experiences of this type, when they occur at all, tend to happen to people during major life transitions, during intense religious practice, or occasionally spontaneously under conditions no one can predict or reproduce. Producing them reliably, in a laboratory, in the space of a single afternoon, with an intervention as simple as a well-prepared dose in a well-prepared setting, was something new. Even more striking, when the participants were followed up 2 months later, many of them continued to rank the experience among the most personally meaningful of their lives, on par with things like the birth of a first child or the death of a parent. 14 months later, a substantial fraction still reported positive changes in mood, behavior, and their relationships with others, which they attributed specifically to the original session. The paper landed in the scientific community with a kind of quiet seismic effect. It was published in a respectable pharmacology journal, with a careful dry vocabulary of legitimate research. It reported on a small sample, as was appropriate for a proof-of-concept study. It made no extravagant claims. It simply observed, in language that other researchers could verify, that a particular pharmacological intervention in a particular setting could reliably produce experiences that a substantial portion of ordinary volunteers considered among the most significant of their lives, and that those experiences appeared to have durable positive effects. Other research groups took notice. Over the following years, similar studies were replicated at different institutions. The findings held. Something that had been stated for decades by traditional practitioners and by the occasional underground therapist, and that had been waved away by the mainstream as unverifiable, was now appearing with increasing consistency in peer-reviewed literature. Griffiths's lab, and several others that followed, began turning the same careful methodology toward more specifically clinical populations. Among the most consequential lines of work that emerged from this period was the investigation of what these experiences might do for people facing terminal illness. This was not chosen at random. The question of the fear of death is, for obvious reasons, one that matters intensely to anyone who knows they are likely to die within a foreseeable period, and clinicians working with terminally ill patients had observed for decades that a substantial portion of such patients suffered not primarily from physical pain, which modern medicine can usually manage, but from what the palliative care literature tends to call existential distress. The raw, unfiltered awareness that one is about to cease to exist. The despair that this awareness can produce. The difficulty of finding meaning in the time that remains. These are not, conventionally, easy things to treat with medication. Standard antidepressants help some patients somewhat. Most of the time, they do not touch the core of the problem. In 2016, Griffiths's group and a separate group at New York University led by Stephen Ross published 2 parallel studies in the same prestigious journal on the same day, reporting on what happened when patients with life-threatening cancer diagnoses were offered a single structured psilocybin session as part of a broader therapeutic program. The results were, once again, striking in a way that made even skeptical readers pay attention. A single session, for many of the participants, produced rapid and substantial reductions in depression and anxiety related to their diagnosis. The reductions were not small, they were not temporary. In many cases, they persisted at follow-up assessments months later without the need for further intervention. Most interestingly, the magnitude of the clinical benefit correlated, almost linearly, with the intensity of what the participants had experienced during the session, as measured by the same mystical experience questionnaire Griffiths had used in his earlier work. The more profound the inner event, the more durable the change in how the patient related to their own mortality. Something about having that particular kind of experience, even once, seemed to rearrange a person's relationship with the fact of their own ending. The participants themselves, when interviewed, described this in various ways, but the descriptions converged on a recognizable shape. Many reported feeling during the session that the ordinary sense of being a bounded, isolated self had temporarily softened or dropped away entirely. They had experienced themselves as part of something larger, something that did not seem to share the obvious finitude of the individual body. They had felt, in ways that resisted verbal description, that whatever was at the root of their being was not the kind of thing that could, in any straightforward sense, be extinguished by the end of the body. Some of them framed this in traditionally religious terms. Others framed it in more naturalistic terms, as a recognition that they were part of the broader pattern of living things, and that the pattern would continue even when their particular pocket of it came to an end. The specific theological interpretation varied. The underlying reduction in terror across participants was remarkably consistent. One particularly striking element, repeated across many of the interviews, was that patients did not describe the experience as having given them a new belief they had not previously held. They described it, rather, as having given them a direct knowing of something they had previously been able to hold only as an idea. Many had grown up in religious backgrounds. Many had spent their adult lives thinking about mortality, as most people occasionally do. They were not short on vocabulary about what happens when a person dies. What the session appears to have given them was not a new vocabulary, but an experience they had not previously had, and that experience had then changed their relationship to vocabularies they had already possessed. Concepts they had carried, thinly, as intellectual propositions became, for some, felt recognitions. The difference, as several participants put it, was the difference between reading a description of swimming and actually being in the water. Both can be useful. Only one changes the body's relationship with water. The sessions, for many participants, had put them in the water for the first time, and once you have been in the water, reading about it is never quite the same again. It is worth pausing to appreciate what this research was showing, because it was, among other things, a quiet vindication of what the ancient traditions had been saying all along. The broader research program that grew out of this early work has, over the following decade, expanded in directions that would have seemed implausible even 10 years earlier. Studies on treatment-resistant depression have shown that structured psilocybin sessions, combined with psychological support, can produce substantial improvements in patients who had not responded to conventional antidepressants. Work on alcohol dependence has shown similar promise, with certain trials reporting sustained reductions in drinking that exceeded what most standard interventions can achieve. Smoking cessation trials have shown remarkably high rates of long-term abstinence, sometimes exceeding 70% at long follow-ups, with only 2 or 3 carefully prepared sessions. MDMA, which is not classified as a classical psychedelic in the same pharmacological family, but which shares some features at the level of therapeutic mechanism, has been investigated extensively for severe post-traumatic stress, with results that have led regulatory agencies to give it breakthrough therapy designation. The picture is not uniformly rosy. Some studies have shown smaller effects than the headline results suggested. Some have had methodological issues that subsequent analyses have flagged. The field is young, the samples are still small, and the full clinical picture is still being worked out. But the general direction of the research is consistent enough that even cautious commentators have begun to speak of a genuine shift in what psychiatric practice might look like in the coming decades. There is a particularly moving chapter in this story, which involves Griffiths himself in a way he could not have anticipated when he began the work. In the fall of 2021, after 15 years of leading what had become the most influential academic research program on these compounds in the world, Griffiths received a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer. The prognosis was grim. The research he had spent so many years conducting on how certain kinds of inner experience could transform a person's relationship with their own mortality was now, without warning, a set of findings he was going to have the chance to test on himself. He spoke publicly about the diagnosis in several interviews over the following year, with a candour and equanimity that were remarkable to witness. He explained that the years of meditation practice he had maintained, combined with the understanding that had grown out of his research, had given him resources he might not otherwise have had. He did not in those interviews claim to have eliminated his fear or to have achieved anything resembling perfect serenity. He described rather an ongoing practice of meeting what was happening to him as directly as he could, without the usual layers of denial and resistance, and finding that the direct meeting, though difficult, was somehow more bearable than the alternative. He continued to work. He recorded conversations with colleagues and friends. He helped set up an endowed professorship at Johns Hopkins to ensure the research program would outlive him. And in October of 2023, he died at the age of 77. The fact that the leading scientist of the modern psychedelic renaissance ended up walking the exact terrain his research had been mapping gives the whole story a quality that is difficult to write about without overclaiming. One does not want to be mawkish. Griffiths himself, by all accounts, would have disliked that. What can be said, carefully and without embellishment, is that his final years were an unusual combination of professional commitment and personal test, and that the lessons he had spent decades articulating seemed to hold up under the conditions for which they were most urgently needed. That is not proof of anything metaphysical. It is simply a piece of evidence about how a lifelong inquiry into certain states of consciousness actually played out for one particularly thoughtful and careful investigator when his turn arrived. The conclusions Griffiths drew toward the end of his life are worth sitting with, because they do not fit neatly into either the enthusiast or the skeptic camp that tends to dominate popular discussion of these compounds. On the one hand, he remained firmly convinced that the experiences these substances could produce were among the most potentially important tools available to modern psychiatry, and, perhaps, to a broader human project of understanding consciousness. On the other hand, he was equally firm that the compounds by themselves were not the destination. They were, at best, an extraordinarily efficient introduction. They could reliably produce in an afternoon the kinds of experiences that contemplative traditions had historically taken decades to cultivate. But the experience itself, however profound, was not the same as integration of the experience into a lived life. An integration, he argued over and over, in interviews and in his late writings, required ongoing practice. The practice he kept returning to was meditation. Not any specific sectarian form of it, though he had drawn on several traditions over the years. Meditation in the general sense of cultivating a direct and ongoing relationship with the immediate texture of one's own experience. The practice he described was quite simple in outline and very demanding in long-term execution. It involved essentially learning to notice thoughts as they arose, recognize them as thoughts rather than as reality itself, and let them pass through the space of awareness without being automatically identified with. That is, in a way, the same basic instruction that shows up in contemplative manuals from dozens of different traditions across several millennia. It had, of course, been kicked around for so long and in so many self-help books that it could easily sound like a platitude. What Griffiths observed, drawing on his own practice and on the research, was that the platitude turned out, when actually attempted, to be considerably more difficult than it sounded, and considerably more transformative than most people suspected. Anyone who has tried to sit quietly for 20 minutes and simply watch the mind do what it does will, after a minute or two, be introduced to a surprise. The mind is not quiet. The mind is, in fact, a small factory producing a continuous stream of thoughts at a pace the practitioner had not previously realized. Most of those thoughts are not new. They are variations on a small number of themes the mind has been working through for years, the same worries, the same self-evaluations, the same rehearsals of future conversations and replays of past ones. For most beginning meditators, the first and most humbling discovery is that the inner landscape they had assumed they controlled turns out to be running on almost complete automation, and that they, whoever they are, have been along for the ride most of the time without knowing it. The simple instruction to notice the thoughts without identifying with them requires, it turns out, years of practice to actually execute, because the habit of identification is so deep that the very noticing gets pulled back into identification within seconds. None of this, it should be stressed, is a character flaw. It is simply how the machinery works. Meditation, in its serious forms, is a slow training in a different relationship with that machinery, and the slowness is not incidental. It is, in many ways, the whole point. The mechanism by which such practice works, as best modern neuroscience can articulate it, connects directly back to everything we have been tracking in these chapters. The ongoing stream of self-referential thought that the default mode network so reliably produces is not in itself the problem. As noted earlier, the network has real and necessary work to do. What becomes a problem is the habitual, almost unconscious identification of oneself with the content of that stream. The thoughts arise, one treats them as news, one responds as if the news were reality. The responses produce more thoughts, the pattern reinforces itself. Over months and years, a particular loop of thought becomes so familiar that it feels from the inside like the very texture of being oneself. Meditation, as practiced across the serious traditions, is precisely the long training in a different relationship. The thoughts still arise. One notices them. One recognizes them as thoughts. They pass. Awareness does not follow them down their usual corridors. Over time, the grip loosens, not in one dramatic reversal, but through thousands upon thousands of small noticings, until the relationship with the stream is genuinely different from what it was when one started. This formulation, understated as it is, turns out to be in close harmony with what Huxley had been reaching for in his own vocabulary back in the early 1950s. Huxley had never been under the illusion that a single afternoon with mescaline or any other compound would be enough by itself to remake a person. What he had hoped was that such experiences might become, within a wise and supportive culture, a kind of widely available opening. Not a replacement for traditional contemplative practice, but a complement to it, a way of showing to modern people who had lost their contact with such states that the states were real and reachable and worth cultivating. The direct experience, he argued, could motivate a person to take up the slow practices with a seriousness they would not otherwise have been able to muster, and the slow practices in turn could integrate and extend what the direct experiences had shown. The two together, in his vision, could form the backbone of a contemporary spiritual life suited to a scientifically educated public that no longer found traditional religious vocabularies convincing. Whether the contemporary world is in the process of building anything like what Huxley envisioned, or Griffiths implicitly endorsed, is an open question. The Renaissance of the last 2 decades has been largely medicalized, which has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages include rigor, safety standards, and gradual cultural acceptance. The disadvantages include a tendency to frame these experiences entirely in clinical terms, as treatments for specific diagnosed conditions, which can miss the broader dimension that the older traditions and Huxley had pointed toward. A parallel conversation is happening in various religious and contemplative communities about how or whether to incorporate these compounds into existing practices. Certain indigenous traditions continue to work with them, as they have for centuries. New forms are emerging, the cultural experiment is live, and its long-term shape is not yet clear. What can be said, bringing this long arc to some kind of landing, is that the central question Huxley was wrestling with in that Hollywood garden in 1953 has not been resolved. It has, if anything, become sharper over the intervening decades. The gap between our two inherited visions, between Brave New World on one side and the doors of perception on the other, has not narrowed. We have more tools. We have more data. We have, in small, careful ways, begun to rebuild some of the knowledge that was lost when the older mystery traditions were closed down. But we also live in a world increasingly organized around distraction, around the continuous activation of exactly the self-referential machinery that makes ordinary life feel smaller than it needs to, around a pace of stimulation that leaves almost no room for the kind of quiet in which deeper patterns might become visible. The pharmacology has been recovered. The culture that can hold the pharmacology responsibly is still being figured out. Where this leaves each of us, individually, is a question none of the scientists or contemplative teachers or philosophers we have met tonight are positioned to answer on our behalf. They can tell us what they have found, they can offer vocabularies and frameworks, they cannot live the question for us. What they have collectively suggested from different angles and across very different disciplines is something approximately like this. The feeling of being a bounded, isolated self, looking out at a world from which one is fundamentally separate, is not the final word on what a human being is. The feeling is produced by specific machinery. The machinery can be tuned. There are many ways to tune it, some slower than others, and none of them is a shortcut in any meaningful sense. Underneath the feeling, or alongside it, or intermixed with it, there is something that does not experience itself as bounded or isolated in the same way. Whether this something is a metaphysical reality, a specific mode of the brain's self-organization, a feature of the universe we happen to be embedded in, or some combination of these, is a question the most careful thinkers in this territory have tended to hold open rather than close. Traditions disagree, researchers disagree. What is reasonably clear is that reports of direct acquaintance with this something keep cropping up across every culture that has looked for them throughout recorded history. They show up under very different conditions. They produce, when they occur, a similar recognizable shift in how a person experiences their own life. And they are, apparently, available to ordinary human beings under a much wider range of circumstances than most modern societies have prepared their citizens to expect. The image we began with, of a novelist in a sunlit garden encountering a flower as if for the first time, has perhaps grown a little clearer over the course of these chapters. Not because we have explained the experience away, the mystery remains, even with every piece of machinery mapped. The receptor is just a receptor. The network is just a network. The experience itself, when it occurs, is not reducible to the diagram, any more than music is reducible to a list of frequencies. What has been mapped, tentatively and with much still uncertain, is how such experiences become possible. What lies behind them, The actual question of what the novelist was actually encountering when he looked at his flower is a question the best researchers in this field tend to hold with a particular kind of respectful humility. The garden is real. The machinery that allows us to see it is real. What is seeing it through the machinery is the thing the traditions have been circling for millennia and about which we probably know less than we sometimes pretend. If you have stayed with the story this far, you have walked, at least in outline, a long and strange path. From a quiet afternoon in 1953 to the edge of the most recent clinical trials, through entropy, Bayes, and the logic of prediction, into the critical point where ordinary consciousness balances its daily show, back to a myth of a garden and the long shadow of a shift from gathering to farming. Through the identification of a specific neural substrate of the narrating self, down into a receptor complex evolution installed as an emergency reset, out to a temple on the Greek coast and the slow, deliberate closure of the Western ritual valve, forward to a Swiss laboratory, a magazine essay, a Harvard seminar, and a cultural crackdown, forward again to a slow, careful reopening in Baltimore, and to the quiet integration of an ancient insight into the most contemporary of scientific frameworks. Along the way, you have met a handful of thoughtful people across many centuries, all of whom have been pointing in their own vocabulary at roughly the same, mostly unmapped territory. Whether any of this changes how you move through the next ordinary day or the next ordinary flower is not something a narrator can determine from this side of the screen. It is up to you. The most the traditions would say, and the most the contemporary research would suggest, is that the mystery the novelist found in his garden is not in the garden the way a coin is in a pocket. It is closer and stranger than that. It is present in its quiet way, in whatever small corner of the world you are currently occupying, including the one you will occupy a minute from now when this story ends and the room you are in returns to its ordinary silence. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep well, wherever you are, and may your dreams be gentle. Good night, and sweet dreams.